My mother stared at me across the white linen tablecloth of a five-star restaurant and ordered me to hand over the $2 million my grandfather left in my name. "We are family," she said, her voice dripping with poison dressed up as love. "This is what you should do." I said absolutely nothing. I just sat there. But the next morning, I handed them a sealed envelope from his lawyer. When my mother finished reading it, she broke down in tears for the very first time in my life. Before I tell you exactly what was in that envelope, let me tell you how I ended up at that dinner table in the first place. My name is Chloe Evans. I am 29 years old. I work 60-hour weeks as a financial auditor in Chicago. I spend my days crunching numbers, tracking down missing assets, and exposing financial inconsistencies. I have built a solid, quiet life for myself. I live in a modest apartment. I drive a reliable car, and I pay my own bills. I have always paid my own bills. The steakhouse my parents chose for this ambush was loud, expensive, and intimidating. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over wealthy patrons, slicing into dry-aged steaks. The air smelled of roasted garlic and rich red wine. I was completely cornered in a circular leather booth. On my left sat my father, Robert. He spent the entire evening staring at his water glass, avoiding my eyes. My father was a man who chose peace over justice every single time, which meant he always agreed with my mother. On my right sat my older sister, Sarah. She was the undisputed golden child of our family. She practically glowed in a designer silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Beside her was her husband, Trent, swirling a $30 glass of scotch with a smug, entitled grin plastered across his face. And directly across the table, acting as the judge and jury, sat my mother, Patricia. Patricia tapped her perfectly manicured fingernails against the polished mahogany table. The sound was sharp like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds until my compliance. She reached into her designer handbag and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table until they hit my plate. "Sign over the inheritance, Chloe," she commanded. Her voice was low and controlled, but it carried the crushing weight of a gavel dropping in a courtroom. Trent's tech startup needs the capital to expand. Families sacrifice for each other. It is simply what we do. I looked down at the stark white paper, and then I looked at my own sleeves. I was wearing a plain navy blue blazer I had bought on clearance 3 years ago. I wore it because I had spent my entire adult life paying off the crushing student loans I had to take out just to survive. My parents had refused to pay a single dime toward my college tuition. They sat me down when I was 18 and claimed they were simply too strapped for cash to help me. Yet somehow, in that very same year, they miraculously found the money to fully fund Sarah's tuition at a private university, pay for her European backpacking trip, and put down the deposit on her luxury townhouse. I was always the backup plan, the spare part, the child who was expected to be seen only when she was useful and heard only when she was agreeing to give up something of her own. Now suddenly, I was the absolute center of their universe. Not because they suddenly loved me, not because they wanted to know how my grueling auditing job was going. They were looking at me because I held the keys to something they desperately wanted. $2 million. That was the exact amount my grandpa Thomas had left exclusively to me in his liquid trust just 1 week prior. He did not leave a penny of it to his own daughter, Patricia. He did not leave a cent to his favorite granddaughter, Sarah. He left it entirely to the granddaughter who had sat by his hospital bed while the rest of the family was out playing golf. Trent leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He flashed a set of overly bleached teeth. "Come on, Chloe," he said smoothly, using that corporate voice he thought worked on everyone. "Think of it as a smart investment. You are a financial auditor, right? You understand return on investment. My company is right on the edge of going public. You sign this money over today, we get the bridge loan covered, and everyone wins. Your sister gets the financial security she deserves, and you finally get to be a real team player." A team player. The words felt like a physical slap across the face. They wanted me to be a team player for a team that had never once let me step onto the field. I glanced at my father again. "Dad," I said quietly, "do you agree with this? Do you really think I should just hand over everything Grandpa left me?" He flinched finally, looking up from his water glass. His eyes were full of a pathetic, hollow guilt. "Chloe, please," he mumbled, refusing to hold my gaze. "Your mother knows best. Trent really needs the help right now. We do not want to see your sister struggle. It is just money, sweetheart. You have a good job. You can make your own way. The sheer audacity of his words washed over me. You can make your own way. I had been making my own way since I was 18 years old. I had survived on ramen noodles and 4 hours of sleep to get my degree. I had built my career from the ground up while they threw lavish parties for Sarah's minor achievements. And now they wanted to swoop in and harvest the one windfall I had ever received. I looked at Sarah. She was carefully slicing a piece of filet mignon, acting as though demanding my inheritance was just standard dinner conversation. You really are being incredibly selfish right now, Chloe, Sarah said without even looking up from her plate. Trent is trying to build a legacy for our future children. Grandpa was clearly confused at the end. He meant to leave that money to the family trust. You holding on to it is basically stealing from us. Stealing from them. The hypocrisy was so thick it was suffocating. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream. I felt the familiar burn of tears behind my eyes, the old instinct to cry and apologize just to make the tension go away. But then I felt the heavy weight of the business card sitting inside my purse, the card belonging to my grandfather's estate lawyer, a man who had looked me in the eye just a few days ago and warned me that exactly this would happen. I looked back at my mother. She was watching me with cold, expectant blue eyes. She truly believed I would fold, and why would she not? She had spent 29 years conditioning me to bend to her will. Patricia had built a twisted kingdom where she was the undisputed queen, Sarah was the flawless princess, and I was the peasant expected to scrub the floors and be grateful for the privilege. But I was no longer a terrified teenager trying to earn scraps of affection. I was a professional auditor who knew how to spot a bad deal from a mile away. I looked at the legal documents resting against my plate. They wanted $2 million. They wanted my future. They wanted the only gift my grandfather had ever given me. I pushed the stack of papers back across the mahogany table. The thick parchment slid until it bumped against Trent's water glass. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and spoke with a calm I did not know I possessed. I am not signing these, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried over the clinking of silverware and the low hum of the restaurant. I am not giving Trent $2 million. That money was left to me by Grandpa Thomas, and I intend to honor his wishes. For a moment, the table was entirely silent. Trent's smug smile vanished, replaced by a hard, ugly sneer. Sarah let out a dramatic gasp, dropping her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter. But it was not my sister or my brother-in-law who broke the silence. It was my father. My father, Robert, was a man who had spent my entire 29 years of life blending into the background. He was a man who never raised his voice, never took a stand, and never defended me when my mother tore me down. Suddenly, his face turned a mottled, furious red. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the wine glasses rattle and drawing the attention of the diners seated near us. "You selfish, ungrateful disappointment," he hissed. His voice was thick with a venom I had never heard from him before. "We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. And the moment your family actually needs you, the moment your sister needs you, you turn your back on us. You are exactly what your mother always said you were. A bitter, jealous girl who cannot stand to see her sisters succeed." The words hit me like a physical blow. If my mother had said them, I could have brushed it off. I was used to her cruelty. But hearing my father, the man I had spent my childhood secretly hoping would protect me, call me a selfish disappointment tore a hole straight through my chest. My hands started to shake in my lap. My throat tightened so painfully I thought I might choke. I wanted to scream that I had paid for my own life since I was 18. I wanted to ask him what exactly they had given me, other than second-hand clothes, and a lifetime of anxiety. But I bit my tongue. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down in public. My mother leaned forward, placing her hand over my father's trembling fist to calm him. She did not look angry. She looked like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. She stared at me with eyes so cold they could have frozen a raging river. "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," she said, her tone absolute and unyielding. "You are going to take these documents home. You are going to read them, and you are going to sign them. I am giving you until Friday at 5 in the afternoon. If you do not deliver that signed paperwork to Trent's office by then, you are done." She paused to let the threat settle over me. "You will no longer be a daughter of this family. We will block your number. We will not invite you to holidays. You will be completely and utterly dead to us. Do you understand me?" She expected me to crumble. She expected me to beg for forgiveness, to grab the pen and sign my life away just to keep my place in a family that had never truly wanted me. But as I sat there, looking at the three people who shared my blood, I realized something incredibly liberating. They were not threatening to take away a loving family. They were threatening to take away my abusers. They were holding a toxic, one-sided relationship over my head like it was a prize I should be begging to keep. I slowly stood up from the leather booth. I reached into my purse and pulled out 2 crisp $50 bills. I placed them deliberately on top of the unsigned legal documents. "That is for my steak and my salad," I said, making sure to keep my voice perfectly steady. "I always pay my own way. You should try it sometime." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked out of the steakhouse. I kept my shoulders pulled back and my head held high as I navigated through the crowded dining room. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, damp Chicago night air. The city noise washed over me. The sirens, the traffic, the hum of millions of people living their lives. For the first time in my entire life, I took a breath that felt genuinely free. My legs were shaking as I walked down the block toward where I had parked my car. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind a deep, exhausting ache in my bones. I had done it. I had finally stood up to them. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the silence of the vehicle wrap around me like a protective blanket. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the headrest. I thought the worst was over. I thought walking away was the hardest part. But just as I put the key into the ignition, my phone lit up in my purse. It buzzed with an urgent notification. I pulled it out, expecting an angry text from Sarah or a guilt-tripping voicemail from my father. Instead, it was an urgent email from Jonathan, my grandfather's estate lawyer. The subject line read, "Urgent legal notice regarding the trust." My heart dropped into my stomach as I tapped the screen. I read the single terrifying sentence he had sent. "Chloe, your parents just filed an emergency injunction to freeze the accounts and are preparing to sue you for undue influence and elder abuse. Please call me immediately. We need to prepare for war." To understand exactly why my mother was willing to threaten me with complete isolation, you have to go back exactly 1 week before that miserable dinner at the steakhouse. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting in a heavy, oversized leather chair inside the mahogany-lined office of Jonathan, my grandfather's estate attorney. The room smelled of expensive floor wax and old paper. The atmosphere was incredibly thick, but not with grief. It was thick with pure, unadulterated greed. My grandfather, Thomas, had passed away just 3 weeks earlier. He was a true force of nature. He was a self-made, no-nonsense businessman who had built a massive commercial supply company out of the back of a rusted pickup truck. Even in his late 80s, his hands were rough and calloused. He never cared for the country club lifestyle my mother obsessed over. He hated the pretension. He hated the fake smiles. But most of all, he hated the cruel way my parents treated me. Grandpa Thomas was the absolute only person in my entire bloodline who ever looked at me and saw someone worth loving. When my parents blatantly refused to pay for my college tuition, it was Grandpa Thomas who secretly slipped me checks to cover my heavy textbooks. When I finally earned my certified public accountant license, after years of grueling night classes, he was the only one who took me out to celebrate. He used to tell me that hard work builds character, but suffering fools only builds deep resentment. I missed him so much my chest physically ached. But that morning in Jonathan's office, my family was practically vibrating with excitement. My mother, Patricia, wore a tailored black dress that looked much more suited for a victory lap than a period of mourning. She sat perfectly straight, clutching her designer handbag, her eyes fixed firmly on the thick manila folder resting on the lawyer's desk. Beside her, my father, Robert, looked mildly uncomfortable, as he always did, but he kept nodding along whenever my mother whispered to him. Across from them sat my sister Sarah and her arrogant husband Trent. They were not even trying to hide their anticipation. While we waited for Jonathan to organize his legal files, Sarah was literally scrolling through high-end real estate listings on her mobile phone. I could easily see the glowing screen from where I sat. She was looking at million-dollar vacation cabins in Aspen. Trent was leaning back in his chair, his arms crossed casually behind his head, looking exactly like a man who had already cashed a winning lottery ticket. They all naturally assumed that Grandpa Thomas had left his vast fortune to be divided among them, the so-called proper members of the family. They assumed I was only invited out of some outdated legal courtesy to receive a token sum. Jonathan finally sat down. He was an older, stern man with sharp grey eyes that missed nothing. He had been my grandfather's closest friend and trusted legal counsel for over 30 years. He knew every single dark corner of our toxic family dynamic. He looked around the room, letting the heavy silence stretch until my mother shifted impatiently in her expensive seat. "Let us begin," Jonathan said, his voice completely flat and professional. He carefully broke the heavy wax seal on the final will and testament of Thomas Evans. Jonathan slowly read through the standard legal declarations, confirming my grandfather's identity and the official revocation of any prior wills. My mother tapped her foot on the carpet, clearly eager for him to get straight to the numbers. Then Jonathan turned to the second page. Article 4. Specific bequests, Jonathan read aloud. To my daughter Patricia, I leave the entirety of my antique family photo albums. I leave these to her in the sincere hope that looking at our history might remind her of the true meaning of family, a concept she seems to have entirely forgotten over the years. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that happens right before a bomb detonates. My mother instantly stopped tapping her foot. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked like a stiff mask painted over a ghost. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her chalk white and trembling. She stared directly at Jonathan, her mouth hanging slightly open, totally unable to process the words she had just heard. "Photo albums," Patricia whispered, her voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of shock and rising fury. "What about the financial accounts? What about the commercial properties?" Jonathan did not even bother to look up from the legal document. He simply turned to the next thick page and continued reading, raising his voice slightly to easily cut through her frantic interruption. Article 5, Designation of Liquid Assets. The entirety of my liquid investment portfolio, held in the Thomas Evans Revocable Trust and currently valued at exactly $2 million, is hereby bequeathed solely and exclusively to my granddaughter, Chloe Evans. For a split-second, time itself seemed to freeze. I completely stopped breathing. $2 million. Solely to me. I stared at Jonathan, entirely convinced I had misheard him. I knew Grandpa Thomas loved me, but I never expected anything like this. I never expected him to hand me the permanent keys to complete financial freedom. Then the room utterly exploded. Sarah shot up from her chair so violently it tipped backward and crashed heavily onto the hardwood floor. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that bounced off the mahogany walls. "That is a lie," Sarah screamed, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "She is the spare. She is the backup. Why does she get the millions while we get a box of dusty old pictures? This is a huge mistake." Trent jumped to his feet right beside his wife, his face flushed dark red with sudden rage, shouting loudly that the legal document had to be totally fabricated. My mother slammed both of her hands flat onto Jonathan's heavy oak desk. She leaned aggressively over it, her blue eyes wide, wild and frantic. My father sat completely frozen in his chair, looking back and forth in a panic between his enraged wife and the impassive lawyer. "You are lying to us," Patricia snarled, her voice dropping into a vicious, guttural growl. "My father would never leave his money to a girl like her. He was an old man. He was 88 years old. He was clearly losing his mind in those final months. He was senile. He did not know what he was doing. She manipulated him. She must have manipulated a sick, confused old man to steal what rightfully belongs to us." I sat perfectly still in my oversized leather chair, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched my mother loudly accuse her own father of losing his mind, all because he had finally chosen to protect the daughter she had spent decades trying to destroy. The grief in my heart was suddenly replaced by a sharp, undeniable clarity. They did not care that my grandfather was gone forever. They only cared that his money was out of their greedy reach. And as my mother continued to scream frantic accusations of senility across the wooden desk, I realized the terrifying war for my future had only just begun. My mother stood there, panting, her chest heaving, as she pointed an accusing finger at my grandfather's estate lawyer. She fully expected Jonathan to fold under her furious outburst. She expected him to apologize, to admit there was some egregious mistake, and to quickly rewrite the narrative to suit her desires. Instead, Jonathan simply adjusted his silver wire-rimmed glasses. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He calmly reached into the thick manila folder on his desk and pulled out a crisp white document bearing the official blue letterhead of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Patricia, Jonathan said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Thomas built a highly successful commercial supply empire from nothing. He dealt with cutthroat contractors and ruthless competitors for 50 years. Did you honestly believe a man of his caliber would leave a $2 million liquid trust vulnerable to a simple medical contestation? Jonathan slid the document across the polished mahogany desk. He tapped his index finger firmly against the bold signature at the bottom of the page. This is an independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. Jonathan continued. It was conducted exactly 7 days before Thomas passed away. It was performed by Dr. William Hayes, one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state of Illinois. Thomas requested this comprehensive evaluation specifically because he anticipated your exact reaction today. My mother stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She did not reach for it. Her manicured hands remained frozen in the air. "Let me save you the trouble of reading the complex medical jargon," Jonathan said, his tone utterly clinical and devastatingly precise. Dr. Hayes certified that Thomas was in absolute perfect command of his mental faculties. The report officially notes that his memory was flawless. His logical reasoning was exceptionally sharp. Furthermore, Thomas explicitly stated during the evaluation that he was purposely excluding you and Sarah from his liquid assets due to a long-documented history of extreme financial recklessness. He knew exactly what he was doing, Patricia. He wanted to ensure his money went to the only person in this family who actually understands the value of hard work. The senility argument is completely dead on arrival. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched my mother's face cycle through a dozen different intense emotions. Disbelief, humiliation, outrage. Her entire legal strategy had been expertly dismantled in less than 60 seconds. She turned to my father, Robert, desperately looking for someone to blame. Robert simply shrank back into his heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the floor, absolutely useless as always. Across the room, Sarah let out a frustrated, whining groan, burying her face in her hands. The $1 million Aspen vacation cabin she had been looking at on her phone just minutes ago was officially gone. Her dreams of endless luxury had evaporated. But the conflict was far from over. When a cornered predator realizes one escape route is blocked, it immediately looks for another path to tear through. And that is exactly what Trent did. Trent stood up abruptly. He slowly buttoned his tailored suit jacket, adopting the arrogant, aggressive posture he regularly used to intimidate his startup employees. He walked over to Jonathan's desk, looming menacingly over the seated lawyer. He did not look at Jonathan, though. He turned his cold, calculating eyes directly onto me. "Fine," Trent said, his voice dripping with absolute malice. "If the old man was not crazy, then there is only one other logical explanation for this absurd will: undue influence." I felt my heart pound rapidly against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the adrenaline suddenly flooding my veins. "Do not play stupid with me, Chloe," Trent sneered, leaning closer to me so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You were the only one sitting by his hospital bed for the last 3 months. You isolated him from his real family. You took advantage of a sick, dying man who was emotionally vulnerable. You fed him vicious lies about Patricia and Sarah to manipulate him into changing his trust in your favor." "That is a disgusting, pathetic lie," I shot back, gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my fingers ached. "I was at the hospital because I loved him. You and Sarah never visited because you were too busy taking lavish weekend trips to Napa Valley. He saw exactly who you were. You isolated yourselves." "It does not matter what the actual truth is," Trent interrupted, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. "It only matters what I can prove in a courtroom, and I have the financial resources to prove whatever I want." Trent turned his arrogant attention back to Jonathan. "I have a team of high-powered corporate lawyers on retainer," he boasted loudly. "Vicious, relentless men who get paid $1,000 an hour to absolutely destroy people. We will file a massive civil lawsuit for undue influence and elder exploitation by the end of the business day. We will drag this estate through probate court for the next 5 years. We will freeze every single asset. Chloe will not see a single dime of that $2 million until she's broke, exhausted, and begging us for a settlement. The sheer cruelty of his threat hung heavily in the air. He was entirely willing to tie up my grandfather's final wishes in a grueling multi-year legal battle just to punish me. He wanted to bleed me dry using his corporate war chest. I looked over at my mother, foolishly expecting her to finally draw a line. I expected her to say that suing her own daughter and dragging our family name through court was going too far. Instead, Patricia straightened her posture. She looked at Trent with profound admiration, then turned her icy glare back to me. "Trent is absolutely right," Patricia said, her voice completely stripped of any lingering maternal warmth. "You manipulated my father. You stole what rightfully belongs to this family. We will destroy you in court, Chloe. You are just a lowly accountant. You cannot possibly afford to fight us. You will be completely bankrupt before you even step foot inside a courtroom." I looked at my father. "Dad," I pleaded quietly, "are you really going to let them do this? Are you going to let them destroy me over money?" Robert did not say a word. He just kept his eyes glued to the carpet, silently endorsing my utter destruction. The family dynamic shattered completely in that exact moment. Any lingering illusion I had about blood, meaning something about unconditional love, evaporated into thin air. They were not my family. They were a pack of starving wolves, furious that they had been denied a carcass, and now they were turning their sharp teeth entirely on me. "We are done here," Trent announced proudly, grabbing Sarah by the arm. "Come on, I need to make a phone call to my legal team right now." Sarah glared at me with absolute unfiltered hatred as she stood up. "You're going to regret this, Chloe," she spat. My mother and father followed them out the door. Patricia did not even look back as she marched out of the office, leaving me sitting completely alone in the heavy leather chair. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, leaving a ringing, terrifying silence in its wake. My hands were shaking violently. I had a solid career, but I did not have the kind of money required to fight a multi-million-dollar corporate legal team. Trent was right about one thing. I was a normal working professional. A protracted legal war against wealthy opponents would absolutely ruin me financially. The threat of a massive lawsuit set the perfect stage for the panic that would consume my entire week. It made me incredibly vulnerable. It made me desperate to avoid a lawsuit at all costs. And that desperate, blinding anxiety was exactly what my mother was counting on to spring her next far more insidious trap. For 3 days after the explosive confrontation in the lawyer's office, I lived in a state of constant suffocating dread. I waited for the heavy knock of a process server on my apartment door. I checked my email every single hour, expecting a massive lawsuit from Trent's high-powered legal team. I barely slept. I jumped at every shadow. But the weekend came and went with absolute silence. No lawsuits, no angry text messages from Sarah, not a single word from my father. Then on Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of a massive quarterly audit review, my cell phone began to vibrate on my desk. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop to the floor. It was my mother, Patricia. My hands actually shook as I picked up the phone. I expected her to start screaming. I braced myself for the vicious threats she had delivered at the steakhouse. But the moment I answered, I heard something that completely paralyzed me. My mother was weeping. It was not her usual performative crying when she wanted to get her way at a department store. These were harsh, guttural sobs that sounded entirely genuine. She was gasping for air, unable to speak. "Mom!" I said, my voice automatically softening despite every boundary I had sworn to maintain. "Mom, what is wrong? What happened? It is your father, Chloe." She choked out, her voice breaking into a ragged whisper. "He is sick. He is so incredibly sick, and we did not know how to tell you." The blood drained from my face. My father. The man who had stood by silently while they tore me down, but still the only father I had. "What are you talking about?" I asked, standing up from my desk and pacing across my small office. "What is wrong with Dad?" "Cancer," she wailed, the word hitting me like a physical punch to the gut. "Aggressive stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The doctors just confirmed the biopsy results this morning. They said it is moving incredibly fast." I stopped pacing. This office around me seemed to spin. I leaned against the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. All the anger and the betrayal from the lawyer's office vanished in a single instant. He was dying. My father was dying. Patricia continued to sob, pouring out a story that hit every single emotional trigger she had spent 29 years installing in my brain. She claimed they had known something was wrong for weeks, but Robert was too proud to admit it. She said that was the real reason they were so desperate for the inheritance money at the steakhouse. They were terrified. They were drowning in medical anxiety, and they took it out on me. "I am so sorry for how we acted, Chloe," she cried, her voice cracking with what sounded like absolute remorse. "We were just out of our minds with fear. Trent was trying to get the money to help us pay for the treatments, and he handled it horribly, but we are out of options. You are the only one who can save his life now." I closed my eyes tightly, gripping the phone. Save his life. The weight of those words was crushing. What treatments, I asked, trying to force my professional auditor brain to engage. If it is stage 3, there must be an oncology plan. "The standard treatments will not work. The doctor said he is not strong enough," she replied, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "But there is an experimental immunotherapy trial at a private clinic in Houston. It has an 80% success rate for his specific tumor marker. The problem is, our insurance company flat out denied the claim. They called it experimental and refused to cover a single dime. The clinic requires a massive upfront deposit before they will even admit him." "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. $500,000, she sobbed. "They need a wire transfer by tomorrow afternoon, or they give his spot to the next patient on the waiting list. Chloe, he will die without this trial. Your father will die, and it will be because we could not find the money." A terrifying, agonizing silence stretched between us. I stood there trapped in the wreckage of my family dynamics. A voice in the back of my head screamed at me to be careful. It reminded me of the cruelty in Trent's eyes and the venom in Sarah's voice just days ago. But an even louder voice, the voice of a daughter who desperately wanted to be a good person, drowned it out. This was a matter of life and death in the broken American healthcare system. If I let my father die simply because I wanted to hold onto a grudge, I would be exactly the monster my mother always claimed I was. My deeply ingrained sense of familial duty took over completely. The years of neglect, the financial abuse, the blatant favoritism, it all took a backseat to the terrifying thought of attending my father's funeral. "Okay," I said, swallowing hard. "Okay, Mom, I will help him. I will pay for the treatment." "Oh, thank God," Patricia gasped, breaking into a fresh wave of tears. "Thank you, Chloe. Thank you so much. I knew you had a good heart. I knew you would not let your family down." "I need to see the medical bills," I told her, letting my professional instincts surface just a little. "I have to verify the clinic details and the routing numbers to initiate a wire transfer of that magnitude. It triggers a lot of federal banking flags. I will need the official invoices." Of course, she agreed instantly without a single second of hesitation. "We have all the paperwork sitting right here on the kitchen table. Trent is here helping us sort through the medical files. Please, just come over right now. Come to the house. We can go over the documents together, and you can set up the wire transfer from your laptop." I told her I was on my way. I hung up the phone and grabbed my purse. My hands were still shaking as I packed up my laptop. I slipped my digital dictaphone into my bag, a hardwired habit from years of conducting complex field audits. I always recorded my verbal notes when reviewing complicated financial documents. I threw on my coat and rushed out of the building. As I drove toward the wealthy suburbs, my mind was entirely focused on my father. I was terrified for him. I was already calculating how to liquidate a portion of the trust fast enough to clear a $500,000 wire transfer by the next morning. I drove straight into the belly of the beast, driven by nothing but panic and misplaced love, completely unaware that my mother was smiling the moment she hung up the phone. I had no idea I was walking directly into the most malicious financial trap of my entire life. I pulled my practical sedan into the wide paved driveway of my parents' suburban estate. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow as I rushed up the pristine brick walkway. I had spent the entire 30-minute drive frantically running mental calculations, figuring out exactly which mutual funds in my grandfather's trust I could liquidate first thing in the morning to cover my father's $500,000 medical wire. I was terrified. My hands shook as I pushed open the heavy oak front door. I expected the house to feel like a hospital waiting room. I expected drawn curtains, hushed voices, and the heavy scent of grief. Instead, I walked into the bright sunlit kitchen to find a scene that completely shattered my anxious momentum. My father, Robert, the man supposedly dying of aggressive stage 3 pancreatic cancer, was standing by the marble island. He was wearing his golf polo, looking absolutely perfectly healthy, pouring himself a large cup of coffee. He did not look weak. He did not look frail. When he saw me standing in the doorway, his face flushed a deep, guilty crimson. He immediately set the coffee mug down and averted his eyes, shrinking away into the living room without saying a single word to me. Before I could even process what I was seeing, my mother Patricia swooped into the kitchen. She smelled of her signature expensive perfume and wore a crisp linen blouse. "Oh, Chloe," she said, her voice dropping into a breathless, dramatic whisper that felt entirely rehearsed. "Thank goodness you are here. Your father is trying to be strong, but the pain is just terrible today. Come into the dining room. Trent and Sarah are waiting." I followed her, my heart pounding a strange, warning rhythm against my ribs. I walked into the formal dining room. Trent and my sister Sarah were sitting at the long mahogany table. There were no medical files in sight. There were no hospital invoices. There were no brochures from an oncology clinic in Houston. Instead, resting directly in the center of the table was a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. I sat down slowly, placing my tote bag on the floor next to my chair. "Where are the medical bills?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need the routing numbers for the Houston clinic so I can initiate the wire transfer with the bank tomorrow morning." Trent offered a smooth, polished smile that did not reach his eyes. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers together. "We are handling the clinic logistics, Chloe," he said, "but we realized something critical last night. The $500,000 is just the deposit. Your father's ongoing care, the travel, the subsequent therapies, it is going to bleed that $2 million trust completely dry in less than a year." Sarah nodded vigorously, playing the part of the concerned daughter perfectly. "We cannot let you lose everything Grandpa left you, Chloe. It is not fair to you. That is why we came up with a comprehensive strategy." Trent continued sliding the thick stack of papers across the polished wood toward me. "This is an asset management power of attorney. If you sign this, you authorize my firm to legally merge the remainder of your inheritance into my commercial tech portfolio. It is a highly aggressive growth fund. The dividends alone will generate enough passive income to pay for Robert's ongoing treatments indefinitely. You save your father and your principal inheritance continues to grow. It is a total win for everyone." I stared down at the document. My grandfather's warning echoed loudly in my ears. I reached out and pulled the contract toward me. Patricia leaned over my shoulder, holding out a silver pen. "Just sign the last page, sweetie," she urged, her voice thick with fake maternal affection. "Trent's legal team stayed up all night drafting this to protect you. We just need this done today so we can get your father on that plane to Houston." I did not take the pen. I am a certified public accountant. I am a financial auditor who spends 60 hours a week tearing apart complex corporate ledgers to find hidden liabilities. I opened the document to the first page and began to read. It took me less than 40 seconds to realize that I was holding a financial death warrant. The title at the top of the page was completely misleading. This was not an asset management power of attorney. I flipped to page 4, scanning the dense blocks of legal jargon. My eyes locked onto a section labeled Indemnification and Liability Transfer. My blood ran completely cold. According to the fine print, by signing this document, I was not just investing my money into Trent's limited liability company. I was legally binding myself as a full corporate guarantor. The contract explicitly stated that I would assume equal personal liability for all existing and future debts, liens, and legal judgments against Trent's company. It was a blind assumption of debt. If Trent's company went bankrupt, the creditors could completely legally drain my entire $2 million trust. If he was sued for fraud, my assets would be seized to pay the settlements. They were not trying to save my father from cancer. They were trying to use my grandfather's money as a human shield to save Trent from complete financial ruin. I looked up. Trent was watching me like a hawk, his eyes narrowing, as he realized I was actually reading the clauses instead of just signing the signature line. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "This is quite a complex corporate merger agreement," I said, keeping my tone mild and entirely professional. "It is standard boilerplate language for high-yield asset management," Trent replied quickly, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Do not overthink it, Chloe. We are running out of time. I closed the folder. I knew that if I confronted them right now, if I accused them of fraud in this dining room, they would panic and find another way to corner me. I needed to get out of this house immediately. I needed to act like the naive, compliant daughter they always believed I was. "You are right, Trent," I said, forcing a small apologetic smile onto my face. "It makes total sense to generate passive income for Dad's treatments, but I cannot sign this right now." My mother's face darkened instantly. "What do you mean you cannot sign it? Your father is dying, Chloe." "I know," I said, grabbing my tote bag from the floor and standing up. "But this contract authorizes a massive transfer of liquid assets across corporate lines. If I just sign this here, the federal banking regulators will immediately flag it as money laundering and freeze the entire trust for months. The Houston clinic will not get a single dime." Trent stood up, his jaw clenching. "I have a private notary on standby. A basic notary is not enough for a $2 million corporate liability transfer." I lied smoothly, utilizing every ounce of my professional auditing vocabulary. "I need to take this to my firm. My managing director has a federal clearance seal. I will have him notarize it and push the clearance codes through the banking portal first thing tomorrow morning. It is the only way the funds will clear by tomorrow afternoon." Trent hesitated, his eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. But my lie was perfectly constructed using financial terminology he only half understood. "Fine," Trent snapped, running a hand through his hair. "But you get that finalized the second your office opens. I promise," I said, already backing out of the dining room. "I will handle it." I turned and walked briskly down the hallway. I pushed open the front door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I did not run, but I walked to my car as fast as my legs could carry me. I unlocked the door, threw my bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of their driveway, my heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I thought it might break through. They were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison just to pay off Trent's debts. The realization was sickening. But as I drove away, I reached into my bag to grab my digital dictaphone to record my thoughts. My hand grasped empty air. I had dropped it under their sofa during my frantic rush to escape. I had no idea that small mistake was about to hand me the ultimate weapon. I drove straight back to my small apartment in the city. The entire ride, my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were completely white. My chest was heaving. I had just managed to escape a perfectly laid trap, using nothing but my professional training to outsmart Trent and my mother. I locked my front door, leaned against the cool wood, and finally allowed myself to take a deep, shuddering breath. I needed to document everything that had just happened. As a financial auditor, my mind operates entirely on evidence, timelines, and verifiable facts. If Trent was trying to bind me to a massive corporate debt assumption under the guise of paying for my father's fake cancer treatments, I needed to record every single detail of that conversation while it was still fresh in my memory. I walked over to my kitchen table and reached into my leather tote bag. My hand felt around the bottom for my digital dictaphone. I carry it with me absolutely everywhere. It is a high-end voice-activated recording device that pairs directly with my phone and my wireless earbuds. I use it constantly to record field notes during complex financial audits, logging discrepancies, and client statements. I had just finished an intense audit for a massive logistics firm the week prior. The dictaphone held hours of encrypted voice memos detailing their offshore accounts. It was the most vital tool of my profession. If I lost that device, my firm would face severe penalties, and my hard-earned career would be over. My fingers brushed past my wallet, my keys, and my notepad. I dug deeper. The dictaphone was gone. A cold wave of pure panic washed over me. I dumped the entire contents of my tote bag onto the kitchen table. Pens, lip balm, and receipts scattered across the wood, but the heavy silver device was nowhere to be found. I froze, mentally retracing every single step of my morning. I pictured myself sitting in my parents' formal dining room. I pictured my mother leaning over me, pushing that silver pen toward my hand. I pictured myself standing up in a sudden rush, grabbing my bag from the floor and bumping the heavy mahogany chair. I vividly remembered the sharp metallic clatter of something hitting the hardwood floor right before it slid under the plush velvet sofa in the adjacent living room. In my sheer desperation to escape Trent's suffocating presence, I had completely ignored the sound. My dictaphone was sitting underneath my mother's living room sofa. I could not just leave it there. Aside from the highly sensitive client files, I knew that if Trent or Sarah found it, they would immediately realize I had been recording my own thoughts and suspicions about their financial demands. They would know I was onto them. I had to get it back before they discovered it. I checked my watch. It had been exactly 2 hours since I left their house. I grabbed my car keys and practically ran out the door. I merged onto the highway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my forearms cramped. The sky above Chicago had turned a heavy bruised gray, mirroring the absolute knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. The drive back to the affluent suburbs felt 10 times longer than the drive home. My mind raced with dozens of fabricated excuses. I would tell them I dropped my lip balm. I would say I left a very important client flash drive. I rehearsed the lies over and over, praying I could just slip in, grab the device from under the sofa, and leave before my mother could start her emotional manipulation all over again. When I finally turned onto their pristine tree-lined street, the neighborhood was completely quiet. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon. The manicured lawns looked perfectly green and undisturbed. I parked my practical sedan a few houses down the block. I did not want them to see me pull into the driveway and have time to prepare another ambush. I wanted to catch them off guard, retrieve my property, and walk out. I walked quickly up the brick pathway toward their massive front porch. I could hear my own breathing loud and jagged in my ears. I needed to be fast. I needed to be a ghost. The air was still and quiet, save for the distant sound of a lawnmower. As I stepped onto the wide wrap-around porch, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy custom oak front door was not fully shut. It was resting slightly ajar, leaving a gap just wide enough to let a small sliver of the air-conditioned air escape into the summer heat. Trent had likely stepped out to take a phone call and failed to pull the heavy door completely shut behind him. I stood frozen on the welcome mat. My hand hovered inches away from the brass handle. My heart pounded furiously in my chest. I needed a way to locate the dictaphone quickly without crawling around on their living room floor like a fool. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wireless earbuds. My dictaphone had a specific Bluetooth tracking feature. If I put the earbuds in and activated the application on my phone, the device would emit a soft, high-pitched pinging sound, allowing me to find it instantly. I could grab it and announce my presence. I placed the small white earbuds into my ears. I pulled out my phone, opened the proprietary audio application, and tapped the connection button. I waited for the application to load the tracking feature, but I had forgotten one critical detail about that specific recording device. When the dictaphone takes a hard physical impact, like dropping from a tote bag onto a hardwood floor, the internal impact sensor automatically switches the device from standby mode into active live monitor mode. It is a strict security feature designed to recover audio in the event of an emergency. The moment my phone established the wireless connection, the tracking feature did not activate. Instead, the live audio feed from the dictaphone sitting underneath my mother's sofa directly connected to my wireless earbuds. I stood alone, on the quiet porch, surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and perfect suburban silence. But inside my ears, the sound was absolutely deafening. The audio feed was crystal clear, capturing every single word being spoken inside that house. I heard the clinking of glasses. I heard the sound of a wine bottle being uncorked. And then I heard my mother's voice. It was not the desperate, weeping, heartbroken voice she had used on the phone to beg me for my grandfather's money. It was cold. It was calculating. And it was filled with absolute venomous joy. I stood completely paralyzed, on the welcome mat, my hands still hovering in the air. I did not push the door open. I did not make a single sound. I just stood there, breathing shallowly, listening as the people who were supposed to love me began to casually describe exactly how they were going to destroy my entire life. The audio feed coming through my wireless earbuds was so incredibly sharp, it felt as though my family was standing right next to me on the porch. I heard the distinct bright clink of heavy crystal glasses touching together in a celebratory toast. Then my mother's voice cut completely through the digital static. She let out a loud, genuine laugh. It was a bright, joyous sound that I had not heard from her in years. I cannot believe she actually fell for the cancer story, Patricia said, her voice dripping with sheer amusement and cruel satisfaction. I thought she might demand to see a doctor today, but she was practically shaking with fear. Robert is healthier than a horse. I completely stopped breathing. The damp air in my lungs instantly turned to heavy lead. I grabbed the wooden railing of the porch with both hands just to keep my trembling knees from buckling beneath me. I had spent the last 24 hours, terrified, completely out of my mind, desperately planning how to liquidate my only financial safety net to save my father's life. And he was absolutely fine. He was sitting in that dining room drinking coffee and eating breakfast, actively celebrating his own fake terminal illness. I heard my father chuckle softly in the background. It was a weak, compliant sound that made my stomach turn. "I always told you Chloe was soft," Robert replied smoothly. "She gets entirely too emotional. You played her perfectly, Patricia." Hot bile rose in the back of my throat. My own father was complimenting my mother on how expertly she had emotionally tortured his youngest daughter. But the horror was only just beginning. The loud sound of a wooden chair scraping against the hardwood floor echoed through my earbuds. It was Trent. His voice was booming, filled with the arrogant, bloated swagger of a man who firmly believed he had just committed the perfect crime. "We are not completely out of the woods yet," Trent said, his tone suddenly turning deadly serious. "She still needs to bring that notarized paperwork back to me tomorrow morning. But once her signature is locked onto that debt assumption clause, I can finally breathe again." Sarah asked him a question, her voice slightly muffled by the sound of her chewing. "How bad is the company deficit right now, Trent? I know you said we were struggling financially, but you never gave me the actual hard numbers." There was a heavy loaded pause on the audio feed. When Trent finally spoke, the absolute chilling reality of his situation made my professional auditor brain go into a state of rapid overdrive. "I am exactly $2 million in the hole," Trent confessed, his voice entirely devoid of any guilt or shame. "The tech startup was a complete bust 6 months ago. I panicked. I tried to win the capital back to cover the mounting losses. I took the remaining investor funds and put them directly into offshore sports betting and illegal private poker games. I lost every single dime. The investors are furious. They are threatening to go to the authorities by the end of this month. If I do not produce their promised returns, they will demand a full federal investigation." I stood frozen on the welcome mat. A cold rain began to drizzle around me, but I did not feel the water hitting my skin. I was listening to my own brother-in-law casually admit to massive federal wire fraud, gross embezzlement, and illegal offshore gambling. He had stolen millions of dollars from his own clients and gambled it all away. "But that is exactly why Chloe is our absolute savior today," Trent continued, his voice brightening with malicious glee. "The moment she signs that asset management power of attorney, her $2 million trust becomes legally bound to my failing corporate entity. She absorbs the entirety of my limited liability company debts. I am going to transfer the fraudulent liabilities directly into her name and drain her trust completely to pay off the angry investors." My mother spoke up again, sounding slightly concerned, but certainly not for my well-being. "But what happens to Chloe when the authorities realize the original funds were misappropriated? Will they not trace the illegal gambling directly back to your personal accounts?" Trent laughed. It was a harsh, cruel sound that made my blood run freezing cold. "I have spent the last 3 weeks altering the digital ledgers. I have created a massive paper trail that makes it look like Chloe was my silent financial partner all along. She is a certified public accountant. She has the exact financial background needed to make it look completely believable to a judge. When the feds come knocking, she will be the one going to federal prison, not me." Federal prison. He was actively planning to frame me for his own financial crimes. He was going to drain the money my grandfather left me, use it to cover his illegal gambling debts, and then hand me over to the federal government to serve his prison sentence. He was going to strip away my freedom permanently, destroy my accounting license, and ruin my entire life. And my family was sitting right there eating a lovely Sunday brunch, casually listening to him plan my absolute destruction. I waited for my mother to scream. I waited for my father to finally stand up and be a man. I waited for someone, anyone in that house, to say that framing their own daughter for a federal crime was crossing a line they simply could not tolerate. Instead, I heard my sister Sarah speak. Her voice was incredibly light, completely casual, and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. "Well," Sarah said, taking a slow sip of her drink, "serves her right for trying to steal my money. Grandpa Thomas always intended for that trust to go to me and Trent. Chloe is just a selfish thief. If she has to spend a few years in a minimum security facility so we can keep our house and our lifestyle, then that is just the price she has to pay for being greedy. Serves her right. Those three brutal words broke something very deep inside my soul. For 29 years, I had bent over backward to seek their approval. I had worn their old clothes. I had endured their relentless insults. I had rushed over here today, ready to sacrifice everything I owned to save my father from a fatal disease he did not even have. As I stood on that porch, listening to the clinking glasses of the people celebrating my impending incarceration, the last remaining shred of love I held for my family simply died. The devastating heartbreak that had been building inside my chest instantly crystallized into pure calculating ice. I did not feel like crying anymore. I did not feel panicked. I felt a terrifying, absolute calm wash over my entire body. I pulled the wireless earbuds from my ears. I turned away from the heavy oak door and walked silently down the brick pathway toward my car. I was no longer the vulnerable, unwanted daughter they thought they could so easily manipulate. I was a professional auditor who had just been handed the exact blueprints to their criminal enterprise. They wanted to use my name to cover their fraud. They wanted to send me to federal prison. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to dismantle their entire lives brick by stolen brick. I did not go back inside that house. I did not scream or throw stones through their perfectly clean windows. I simply turned around, walked back to my practical sedan, and drove away. The rain was falling harder now, slicking the Chicago streets with a dark, oily sheen, but my mind had never been clearer. For 29 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the girl they could belittle, the girl they could use, the girl they could throw to the wolves without a single second thought. But they had made one massive fatal miscalculation. They forgot what I do for a living. I am a forensic accountant. I hunt financial ghosts for a living. I tear down corporate walls to find the rot inside. And Trent had just handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. I bypassed my apartment completely. Instead, I drove straight into the city, swiping my security badge to enter my accounting firm long after the sun had set. The massive high-rise office was completely empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as I walked down the long corridor to my desk. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, booted up my dual monitors, and cracked my knuckles. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. It was time to go to work. I poured myself a cup of stale bitter coffee from the break room and pulled up our proprietary forensic software. As a senior auditor, I have access to extensive public tax databases, state corporate registry filings, and deeply buried financial disclosures that standard internet searches can never reach. I started with the absolute basics. I typed the name of Trent's much-boasted tech startup into the state business registry, Apex Digital Solutions. Trent always talked about it at family dinners like he was the next Silicon Valley genius. He claimed they were developing revolutionary logistics software that would change the global supply chain. I pulled the initial incorporation documents. They were filed 3 years ago. Then I pulled the annual tax disclosures and the public creditor filings. My eyes darted across the glowing screens, scanning lines of data, cross-referencing employer identification numbers with registered addresses. In my line of work, numbers always tell a story. They do not lie. They do not make excuses. They simply show you exactly where the money flows. And the story Trent's numbers were telling was absolutely horrifying. Within the first 2 hours of my search, the grand illusion of Apex Digital Solutions completely crumbled. A legitimate tech startup has massive overhead. It has payroll records for software engineers. It has expensive patent filings. It has server hosting costs and digital infrastructure investments. Trent's company had absolutely none of those things. It was a hollow shell. It was a ghost ship floating on a sea of fabricated paperwork. The registered corporate address was a tiny windowless virtual mail drop located in a suburban strip mall. There were no employees. There was no revolutionary software. The only consistent outward cash flow I could find was directed toward marketing firms that produced glossy high-end brochures designed specifically to attract private wealthy investors. Trent had basically created a shiny cardboard box, painted the word technology on the side, and sold it to people who had more money than common sense. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I needed to see exactly how deep the hole was. He had confessed on the recording to being $2 million in debt. But the financial footprint I was uncovering suggested something far more sinister than simple business failure. I began tracing the incoming investments. Millions of dollars had poured into the Apex digital accounts over the last 36 months. But the money never stayed there. I watched the digital trail as Trent immediately funneled those investor funds through a complex labyrinth of secondary corporate accounts. He was operating a classic localized Ponzi scheme. He was using the money from new investors to pay small fake dividends to the original investors, creating the complete illusion of a highly profitable company. But the vast majority of the capital was being bled completely dry to fund his and Sarah's lavish lifestyle. I pulled up public property records and matching asset declarations. The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. The luxury vehicles, the constant bragging social media posts about weekend wine tasting trips in Napa Valley, the designer clothes Sarah paraded around in at family events while mocking my practical wardrobe, the massive house renovations they bragged about last Christmas. It was all paid for with stolen money. They had been living like absolute royalty on the backs of defrauded clients. My sister was fully complicit in bleeding innocent people dry, and my parents were perfectly willing to let me take the fall so Sarah could keep her designer handbags. As the clock on my computer clicked past 3 in the morning, I found the final devastating piece of the puzzle. I checked the state and federal civil litigation dockets. There were multiple aggressive inquiries and preliminary injunctions filed by furious investors over the last 4 weeks. Several independent audits had been requested. The walls were rapidly closing in on him. The sheer volume of missing capital meant this was no longer a simple civil dispute over a failed business venture. This was massive federal wire fraud. I sat back in my chair, taking a slow, deep breath into my tired lungs. Trent was not just broke. He was weeks, maybe days away from a parade of federal indictments. The Securities and Exchange Commission would be knocking on his door very soon. He knew the end was near. That was exactly why he and my mother had crafted that brilliant evil plan to fake my father's cancer. They needed my $2 million trust to plug the gaping hole in Trent's fraudulent accounts before the federal investigators froze his assets and handed him a long prison sentence. And if the plan failed, the contract I was supposed to sign would legally transfer his criminal liability directly onto my shoulders. They were going to serve me up on a silver platter to save themselves. I saved every single file. I backed up the public records to a secure external hard drive. I compiled the evidence of the shell company, the fake dividends, and the pending litigation into one massive, undeniable dossier. They thought I was just a naive, desperate daughter who would blindly sign away her life to buy their affection. They were about to learn what happens when you try to con a forensic auditor. I sat in the silent glow of my dual monitors as the city of Chicago slowly began to wake up outside my window. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked past 4 in the morning, but I was completely wide awake. The pure adrenaline pumping through my veins was 1,000 times more potent than the stale break room coffee sitting on my desk. I pressed the print command and listened to the heavy industrial printer roar to life. It was the exact sound of my vindication. Page after page of undeniable proof spilled out into the output tray. I walked over and gathered the warm stack of papers. These were not just financial records. They were the very nails for Trent's corporate coffin. I spread the documents across my large conference table, organizing them into perfectly chronological piles. The first pile was the damning ledger of his hollow tech startup. The second pile was the extensive wire transfer history, showing millions of dollars of stolen investor funds being funneled directly into offshore gambling accounts and luxury purchases for my sister Sarah. The third pile was a staggering list of active bank liens and pending civil litigation. I walked back to my computer and pulled up the audio file I had captured on my porch just a few hours earlier. The accidental recording from my hidden dictaphone was the absolute crown jewel of my arsenal. I plugged an encrypted external hard drive into my computer and transferred a copy of the audio file. Then I uploaded a second copy to a secure cloud server that only I could access. I was taking absolutely no chances. I even emailed a compressed version of the file to a secondary personal email address. I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, this recording would survive. I put my wireless earbuds back in and hit play one more time. I needed the anger to stay fresh. I listened to the clinking of champagne glasses. I listened to my father Robert chuckling about how easily I had fallen for his fake cancer diagnosis. I listened to Trent boasting about his brilliant plan to transfer his fraudulent liabilities into my name and send me to federal prison. And then I listened to my mother Patricia. I listened to her bright, genuine laughter. I listened to her total lack of remorse. She was not just a difficult mother who played favorites, she was a complete monster. For my entire life, I had tried to rationalize my mother's behavior. I had internalized every cruel comment and every financial slight. I had actually believed that if I just worked harder, if I never asked them for a single dime, they would eventually see my worth. I had rushed to their house yesterday, completely willing to drain my grandfather's trust, to save my father from a terminal illness. My deeply ingrained sense of familial duty had almost cost me my entire future. But sitting in my quiet office surrounded by the undeniable proof of their betrayal, a profound shift occurred inside my mind. The last lingering threads of a desperate daughter seeking her mother's love completely snapped. Patricia was actively willing to send her own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. She was willing to let me sit behind bars, stripped of my accounting license, stripped of my freedom, and stripped of my dignity. And why? So she could maintain her pristine country club facade. So Sarah could keep driving a luxury sports car in Napa Valley. So Trent could avoid taking responsibility for his massive wire fraud. They viewed me as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb. The heartbreak was staggering, but it was also incredibly liberating. I finally understood that there was absolutely nothing wrong with me. I was not unlovable. I was just raised by people who were completely incapable of loving anyone but themselves. My grandfather Thomas had known the truth all along. That was why he left the $2 million trust entirely to me. He knew they would squander it, and he knew I would protect it. He had tried to give me the ultimate gift of freedom, and they had tried to turn his final gift into my prison sentence. I picked up a heavy black binder and began carefully sliding the printed documents into clear plastic sleeves. I built the portfolio with the exact same meticulous precision I used for my most high-profile corporate audits. Every bank lien, every fraudulent wire transfer, every fake company registration was perfectly indexed and highlighted. I included a printed transcript of the audio recording, highlighting the exact moments where Trent confessed to federal fraud and my parents openly conspired to manipulate me. By the time I finished compiling the binder, the sun was fully rising over the Chicago skyline. I walked into the office washroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red from lack of sleep, but my posture was entirely different. My shoulders were pulled back. My jaw was set. I was no longer the anxious girl trembling in a mahogany chair while her family screamed at her. I was a senior financial auditor holding a loaded weapon of undeniable truth. I walked back to my desk and picked up my cell phone. I checked the time. It was exactly 8 in the morning. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. I pressed call and listened to the phone ring. It rang twice before a familiar, gruff voice answered on the other end. Jonathan speaking. It was my grandfather's estate lawyer. "Good morning, Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely professional. "It is Chloe Evans. I know it is early, but we have a very serious problem." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Jonathan spoke, his tone shifting from standard legal greeting to sharp, absolute attention. "Chloe," he said, "are you all right? You sound different." "I am perfectly fine, Jonathan," I replied, looking down at the heavy black binder resting on my desk. "But Trent and my parents are not going to be. They tried to corner me into signing a fraudulent asset management contract yesterday afternoon. They faked a terminal cancer diagnosis to force my hand. I have the contract. I have public financial records proving Trent is running a localized Ponzi scheme, and I have a clear audio recording of them discussing their plan to frame me for federal wire fraud. I need you to assemble your litigation team immediately. We are going to war." I pulled my practical sedan into the parking garage of Jonathan's downtown legal firm, just as the morning commuter traffic began to clog the Chicago streets. My entire body felt heavy and brittle. The massive surge of adrenaline that had fueled my all-night forensic investigation was rapidly fading. In its place was a deep, bone-chilling exhaustion. I walked into the grand lobby of the building, clutching the heavy black binder against my chest like a physical shield. The receptionist recognized me immediately and ushered me straight back into the familiar, mahogany-lined office. Jonathan was already sitting behind his massive desk. He had a fresh pot of coffee steaming on a silver tray. He took one look at my pale face, the dark circles under my eyes, and the sheer tension vibrating through my shoulders. He did not offer any empty pleasantries. He simply pointed to the oversized leather chair across from him and poured me a dark, strong cup of coffee. I sat down and took a slow, shaky breath. I did not know exactly where to begin. The sheer magnitude of my family's betrayal was so vast and so entirely evil that saying the words out loud felt almost impossible. I placed the thick black binder onto his polished desk. I opened it to the first section and pushed it toward him. "Trent is not a successful tech entrepreneur," I said, my voice sounding incredibly hollow in the quiet room. "He's running a localized Ponzi scheme. He is completely bankrupt. He took millions of dollars in private investor funds and funneled them directly into illegal offshore gambling accounts to cover his massive losses. He used the rest of the money to fund a lavish lifestyle for himself and Sarah. He is exactly $2 million in debt, and he is only weeks away from facing severe federal indictments." Jonathan did not interrupt me. He put on his silver wire-rimmed glasses and began flipping through the meticulous financial ledgers, wire transfer histories, and active bank liens I had compiled. "But that is not even the worst part." I continued, my throat tightening so painfully I had to force the words out. "They realized they could not contest Grandpa Thomas' trust based on mental competency. They knew they could not win a civil lawsuit. So my mother called me yesterday afternoon crying hysterically. She told me that my father was just diagnosed with aggressive stage 3 pancreatic cancer. She begged me for a $500,000 wire transfer to cover an experimental medical treatment in Houston. She used my guilt and my love to lure me to their house." Jonathan looked up from the documents. His sharp gray eyes locked onto mine. He remained perfectly silent, waiting for me to finish the story. "When I got there, I said, my hands beginning to tremble in my lap, there were no medical bills. There was no cancer. My father is perfectly healthy. Instead, Trent and Sarah tried to force me to sign a highly complex corporate asset management contract. I read the fine print. It was a blind assumption of debt. If I signed it, Trent was going to legally transfer all of his fraudulent liabilities directly into my name. He was going to drain my grandfather's entire trust to pay off his angry investors." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I told Jonathan about my missing dictaphone, the open front door, and the accidental wireless connection. I played the crystal clear audio recording for him right there in the office. The sound of my mother's joyful laughter filled the room. The sound of my father mocking my emotional vulnerability echoed off the walls. And then came Trent's voice explicitly outlining his plan to frame me for his federal wire fraud, followed by Sarah cheerfully declaring that I deserved to go to a federal penitentiary for stealing her money. As the recording finally clicked off, the thick silence returned. And suddenly, the strong professional facade I had maintained all night completely shattered. The dam broke. I dropped my face into my hands and began to weep. I was not just crying because I had narrowly escaped a federal prison sentence. I was crying from the profound, agonizing grief of finally accepting that I never truly had a family. I was grieving the mother who viewed my freedom as acceptable collateral damage. I was grieving the father who actively participated in my destruction just to keep the peace. I was grieving a sister who would happily watch me lose everything just to maintain her country club status. The crushing reality of my lifelong isolation washed over me like a tidal wave. I sobbed openly, my shoulders shaking violently, mourning the unconditional love I had desperately chased for 29 years, but was never going to receive. I sat there, falling apart, expecting Jonathan to offer gasps of horror or expressions of profound disbelief. I expected him to be utterly shocked by the sheer depravity of Patricia and Robert. But Jonathan did not look surprised at all. He did not look shocked. He calmly reached across his desk and pushed a square box of soft tissues toward me. I took a tissue and wiped my wet face, trying to catch my breath. I looked up at the older lawyer, confused by his absolute tranquility in the face of such monstrous revelations. "Did you really think Thomas built a $20 million empire by being a bad judge of character?" Jonathan asked softly, his voice carrying a warm, protective weight. I stared at him, my eyes wide and bloodshot. I did not know what to say. Your grandfather knew exactly what kind of vultures they were. Jonathan continued, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands together. Thomas watched Patricia and Robert manipulate and abuse you for decades. He saw Sarah and Trent bleeding people dry to fuel their own unchecked greed. He knew their exact true nature. He knew they were utterly devoid of any moral compass. Jonathan reached out and gently tapped the heavy black binder full of my forensic evidence. Thomas intentionally structured that trust the way he did to force their hand. Jonathan explained, his tone filled with absolute certainty. He knew that if he left everything to you, they would become desperate. He knew their greed would completely blind them to the consequences. He deliberately set a trap that would force them to expose their true colors to you once and for all, so you would finally find the strength to walk away from them permanently. He gave you the money, Chloe, but more importantly, he gave you the undeniable truth. I sat back in my chair, the tears slowly coming to a halt as Jonathan's words sank deep into my mind. My grandfather had not just protected my financial future. He had orchestrated my emotional liberation. He had given me the final necessary push to sever the toxic chains that had bound me my entire life. We have the evidence, Jonathan said, a fierce, determined glint sparking in his gray eyes. We have the paper trail. We have the audio recording. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate destruction. It is time we show them exactly how that game is truly played. Jonathan stood up from his heavy leather chair. He did not say another word as he walked slowly across the thick Persian rug. He stopped in front of a large oil painting of a sailboat hanging on the far wall. He reached out and swung the wooden frame open on hidden hinges, revealing a brushed steel wall safe built directly into the mahogany paneling. The room was completely silent, except for the sharp metallic clicking of the heavy combination dial as Jonathan expertly spun it left and right. He pulled the heavy steel door open and reached deep into the dark cavity of the safe. When he turned back around to face me, he was holding a thick, bright red envelope. It was sealed with a heavy glob of black wax, stamped with my grandfather's personal signet ring. The bright red paper stood out violently against the muted corporate colors of the law office. Jonathan walked back to his desk and placed the envelope gently on the polished wood right next to my massive binder of forensic evidence. Your grandfather, Thomas, was not just a successful businessman, Chloe. Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. He was an absolute grandmaster at strategy. He knew that leaving you the $2 million liquid trust would make Patricia and Robert lose their minds. He knew Trent was blinded by his own massive greed. He fully expected them to attack you. But Thomas would never leave you defenseless against a pack of starving wolves. I stared at the red envelope. My hands were resting on my lap, but I could feel my pulse throbbing in my fingertips. What is in the envelope, Jonathan? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It is a supplementary addendum to his primary estate trust, Jonathan explained, tapping his index finger against the black wax seal. In the realm of aggressive corporate finance, there is a highly specific defensive strategy used to completely destroy a hostile takeover. It is designed to make the target company so incredibly toxic and financially devastating to the attacker that the hostile bid simply collapses. It is called a poison pill. Thomas took that exact corporate mechanism and he weaponized it for his own family. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He looked at me with a gaze so intense it pinned me to my chair. Thomas embedded a strict poison pill clause, deeply hidden within the broader legal framework of his estate, Jonathan said. The clause clearly dictates that if Patricia, Robert, Sarah, or Trent attempt to extort you, sue you, manipulate you, or cause you any financial harm regarding your inheritance, the defensive mechanism is instantly triggered. There is no lengthy probate battle required. There is no drawn-out civil litigation. It is a completely self-executing legal trap. The moment they cross the line and threaten your financial well-being, the trap snaps shut. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the sheer brilliance of my grandfather's foresight. He had known they would try to break me. He had anticipated the fake cancer diagnosis, the emotional blackmail, and the fraudulent contract. He knew they would try to steal his final gift to me, but I still did not understand how a piece of paper could stop Trent's high-powered corporate lawyers. What does the trap actually do? I asked, my breathing growing shallow. If they trigger the clause, what exactly happens to them? Jonathan offered a small, tight smile. Tell me, Chloe, Do you know how your parents actually afford their incredibly lavish lifestyle? Do you know how they pay for that massive suburban estate where your mother hosts her high society country club dinners? I frowned, completely confused by the sudden change in subject. I always assumed Dad made a great salary at his firm, I replied. I assumed they bought that house decades ago. Your father has been virtually bankrupt for the last 12 years. Jonathan revealed, his words hitting me like a physical shockwave. Robert made a series of incredibly foolish investments and lost almost everything. Patricia refused to downgrade their lifestyle. She refused to give up her pristine image. So your grandfather stepped in to prevent a public scandal. But Thomas did not give them the money. He simply bought the estate under a blind corporate trust that he completely controlled. He allowed your parents to live there rent-free to keep up appearances strictly for the sake of the family name. Your parents do not own a single brick of that house. I sat frozen in my chair. The grand house in the wealthy suburbs, the sprawling green lawns, the sweeping mahogany staircase where my mother posed for her holiday photographs. It was all a complete illusion. It was a massive stage set funded entirely by the man she had just falsely accused of being senile. The poison pill mechanism is beautifully simple. Jonathan continued, his voice steady and sharp. If Patricia or Robert attempt to extort or harm you, the blind trust holding the deed to their estate is instantly dissolved. But the property does not go to a charity or a corporate holding firm. The clause dictates that the deed to that $5 million estate transfers immediately and irrevocably directly into your name. The air in the office felt incredibly thin. I gripped the armrests of my chair, trying to steady the sudden violent spinning in my head. If the clause is triggered, you become the sole legal owner of their home, Jonathan said, spelling out the absolute devastation of the trap. You become their landlord. You gain the absolute legal authority to serve them with a 30-day eviction notice. They lose the house. They lose their country club status. They lose the entire foundation of their fake wealthy identity. They are left with absolutely nothing. Thomas knew the house was their most prized hidden asset. He put the executioner's switch directly into your hands. I looked down at the bright red envelope. Then I looked at the thick black binder containing my digital audio recording and my forensic financial printouts. My mother had faked a terminal illness to steal my money. Trent had openly plotted to frame me for federal wire fraud and send me to a penitentiary. Sarah had laughed at the thought of me sitting in a prison cell. They had crossed every single conceivable moral and legal boundary to destroy me. They thought I was a weak, naive girl they could easily manipulate and discard. They had no idea that by threatening me, they had just stepped directly onto my grandfather's hidden landmine. Jonathan reached across the desk and slid the red envelope toward me. The heavy wax seal felt cool against my trembling fingers. I looked up at the lawyer, my previous tears of grief completely drying up. The profound, heartbreaking sorrow I had felt just moments ago was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute resolve. The trap had been set by a master chess player, and my family had blindly walked right into it. I sat in the oversized leather chair in Jonathan's quiet office, the faint hum of the city traffic drifting up through the thick glass windows. My pulse drummed a frantic, heavy rhythm against my temples. Jonathan had just opened the hidden steel wall safe and placed a bright red envelope directly onto the center of his polished mahogany desk. The envelope was thick and old-sealed shut with a massive glob of black wax that bore the imprint of my grandfather's personal signet ring. I want you to take a very close look at this, Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a low and incredibly serious register. He carefully broke the black wax seal and pulled out a stack of heavy parchment paper. He placed it deliberately in front of me, read the primary title at the top of the first page. I leaned forward, my hands trembling slightly as I rested them on the edge of the desk. I focused my tired eyes on the bold black text stamped across the top of the document. It was a master property deed. It was the official legal record of ownership for a residential property located in the most exclusive gated suburb of Chicago. I read the street address out loud, my voice barely more than a confused whisper. "That is my parents' house," I said, looking up at Jonathan with complete bewilderment. "Why do you have the property deed to my parents' house inside my grandfather's secret safe?" Jonathan folded his hands together and leaned back in his heavy chair. He looked at me with a steady, calculating gaze. You need to understand something very fundamental about your mother, Jonathan began. Patricia has spent her entire adult life meticulously constructing an illusion of extreme wealth and untouchable social status. She treats that massive suburban estate like it is her own personal kingdom. I knew exactly what he meant. That house was my mother's ultimate weapon and her deepest obsession. It was a sprawling 5,000 square foot colonial mansion with perfectly manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and a sweeping marble staircase. Patricia used that house to absolutely dominate her local social circles. She was the aggressive, undisputed president of the Elite Homeowners Association. She hosted lavish catered dinner parties just to flaunt her crystal chandeliers and expensive imported rugs. She constantly judged her neighbors, turning up her nose if someone parked a slightly older car in their driveway or failed to trim their hedges to her impossible standards. She truly believed that living in that house made her vastly superior to everyone else, especially me. 10 years ago, Jonathan continued pulling my attention back to the present moment. Your father attempted to play the role of a brilliant corporate investor. He took out massive, highly leveraged loans against his logistics business to fund a series of incredibly reckless commercial ventures. Robert was always completely desperate to prove he was just as successful as Thomas. But Robert is not a businessman. He is a fool. I listened in absolute stunned silence. 10 years ago, I was just starting college, completely isolated from my family, working double shifts at a local accounting firm just to afford my cheap textbooks and a tiny apartment. They never mentioned a single word about any financial trouble. They were too busy buying Sarah a brand new luxury sports car for her college graduation. The ventures completely collapsed, Jonathan said, his tone flat and clinical. Robert bankrupted his entire business. He drained their personal savings trying to cover up the massive losses. The bank immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on their beautiful suburban estate. They were exactly 3 days away from being physically locked out of that house and thrown out onto the street. The public humiliation would have utterly destroyed Patricia. She would have been completely ruined in the eyes of her precious high society friends. My mind struggled to process the sheer scale of their hidden reality. They had been completely broke. While they were mocking my small apartment and my practical clothes, they were secretly drowning in massive debt. They went to Thomas and begged him for a bailout. Jonathan explained, his grey eyes hardening with the memory. Thomas despised their arrogant lifestyle. He hated the way they treated you, but he also understood the destructive power of a public family scandal. He agreed to step in and save them from absolute ruin. He paid off the bank in full. He settled all of Robert's outstanding corporate debts. He completely erased their financial disaster. Then why do you have the deed? I asked, my voice shaking with a sudden dawning realization. If he paid off the house, why is the deed sitting on your desk? Jonathan offered a slow, predatory smile. Because Thomas was an absolute grandmaster at strategy, he replied. He did not hand the house back to Robert. He knew they would just squander it again. He refused to put Patricia on the title. Instead, Thomas legally purchased the estate out of foreclosure through a silent corporate trust. He allowed your parents to continue living there completely rent-free. He allowed Patricia to maintain her grand illusion of wealth, but he kept the permanent legal ownership of the property securely locked away. Jonathan reached across the desk and tapped his index finger firmly against the bold text, identifying the legal owner of the estate. Read the name of the trust, Chloe, Jonathan instructed quietly. I leaned forward again, my eyes scanning the dense legal text, until I found the designated corporate entity. It was the exact same revocable trust that Jonathan had read from the main will just an hour earlier. It was the exact same trust that held the $2 million in liquid assets. It was the trust that my grandfather had completely and irrevocably transferred to his only granddaughter. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stopped breathing. The heavy mahogany walls seemed to close in around me as the absolute world-shattering truth finally clicked into place. I own the house, I whispered, staring blindly at the paper. Jonathan nodded, his smile widening into something fiercely triumphant. You own every single brick of that house, Chloe. You own the marble countertops. You own the sweeping staircase. You own the perfectly manicured lawn where Patricia hosts her elite garden parties. They do not own a single blade of grass. They are nothing but long-term rent-free tenants living in a property that now legally belongs entirely to you. The sheer poetry of the situation washed over me like a massive tidal wave. My mother had spent my entire life making me feel like a worthless, unwanted guest in her pristine home. She had thrown me out when I was struggling, telling me I was a disappointment who did not belong in her beautiful world. And for the last 10 years, she had been sleeping under a roof that belonged to the man who loved me, and now it belonged to me. I am their landlord, I said, the words tasting like sweet, intoxicating victory on my tongue. Legally speaking, you are their absolute sovereign, Jonathan corrected smoothly. You have the total, uncontested legal authority to serve them with an immediate 30-day eviction notice. You can strip Patricia of her precious home. You can take away the one thing she values more than anything else in this entire world. Thomas gave you the money, but he hid the deed in this envelope to give you the ultimate power. I sat back in my chair, staring at the bright red envelope and the official property deed. My family had spent the entire morning plotting to frame me for federal wire fraud. They had faked a terminal cancer diagnosis to manipulate my empathy. They wanted to steal my financial future and send me to prison just to maintain their fake, luxurious lifestyle. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they held all the cards. But as I sat in that quiet law office holding the legal deed to my mother's entire identity, I realized the game was completely over. They had pushed me to the absolute edge, and in doing so, they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I did not just have the power to protect myself. I had the power to take everything they loved and leave them with absolutely nothing. I sat in the quiet stillness of Jonathan's office, staring at the thick red envelope resting on the polished wood desk. The heavy realization of what my grandfather had done for me settled deep into my bones. He had not just left me a financial safety net. He had left me a fully loaded weapon to use against the very people who had spent my entire life tearing me down. The tears I had shed earlier were completely gone. The frightened, submissive daughter who had desperately craved her mother's affection had died on that front porch yesterday. In her place was a woman who finally understood her own worth. Jonathan leaned forward and folded his hands. He watched me carefully, reading the shift in my posture and the new cold clarity in my eyes. He asked me what I wanted to do next. He told me we could simply mail the documents, file the eviction notice through the county court, and let the legal system slowly crush them. It would be safe and clean and entirely remote. I shook my head slowly. I told Jonathan that mailing a piece of paper was not enough. My mother, Patricia, had spent decades publicly humiliating me. She had built her entire social empire on a foundation of lies, and she was perfectly willing to send me to a federal penitentiary to protect it. Trent and Sarah were actively plotting to steal my future while laughing about it over expensive champagne. Robert, my own father, had faked a terminal illness to manipulate my deepest sympathies. If we simply sent a letter, they would spin the narrative. They would play the victims. They would hire cheap lawyers to drag out the eviction, and they would spend months telling their country club friends that I was an ungrateful, mentally unstable daughter who stole their home. I looked Jonathan right in the eye and told him that I wanted to look them in the face when their entire world collapsed. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror and helplessness they had tried to inflict on me. I wanted them to know that I was the one who finally ended their lifelong charade. Jonathan smiled a slow, dangerous smile. He opened a fresh legal pad and grabbed his pen. He told me that if we were going to spring the trap, we needed to execute it with absolute surgical precision. We sat there for the next 3 hours designing a flawless cinematic strategy. We knew their timeline. Trent was desperate. He had explicitly stated on the hidden recording that he needed my signature locked onto that fraudulent debt assumption clause by Monday morning. That meant they would push for a final meeting this weekend before the federal investigators could knock on his door. I told Jonathan that Sunday brunch was their ultimate stage. Every Sunday, my parents hosted a lavish brunch in the formal dining room of that massive estate. It was where they performed their roles as the perfect wealthy family. It was exactly where they would expect me to show up completely broken and desperate to save my father. Our plan was brilliantly simple. I would call my mother and play the exact part they expected me to play. I would tell her that I was terrified for my father. I would tell her that I had spoken to the bank and that I was ready to sign whatever Trent needed to liquidate my trust and secure the medical funds. I would agree to bring the notarized paperwork directly to their Sunday brunch. I knew exactly how to deliver that performance because I had spent 29 years rehearsing for it. I knew exactly how to make my voice tremble. I knew how to sound small and compliant. I knew how to feed my mother's massive ego and stroke Trent's arrogant, bloated swagger. They would never suspect a single thing because they had never truly seen me as a capable, intelligent adult. They only saw me as an easy, vulnerable target. Jonathan began drafting the necessary execution documents to trigger the poison pill clause. He drafted the formal declaration of grand theft and extortion. He printed the immediate 30-day eviction notice legally stripping Patricia and Robert of their rights to the property. He compiled a secondary packet containing the printed transcripts of Trent's recorded confession to federal wire fraud and illegal offshore gambling. While he prepared the legal filings, I sat in the leather chair and mentally prepared myself for Sunday. I thought about walking through the grand mahogany doors of that beautiful house. I thought about the crystal chandelier and the heavy silver cutlery Patricia cherished so deeply. I thought about how for my entire life I had walked into that house feeling like an unwanted guest, holding my breath and praying I would not do anything to upset them. But this Sunday would be completely different. I would walk into that house as the absolute legal owner of the property. I would be walking into my own home, and I would be walking in to evict the toxic tenants who had tormented me for decades. Jonathan finished printing the documents. He took the original property deed, my grandfather's final protective shield, and placed it inside a fresh, heavy-duty red envelope. He added the eviction notice, the trust transfer confirmation, and the fraud exposure packet. He sealed the flap tight and slid the thick package across the desk toward me. The switch was the most crucial part of the strategy. I would arrive at the brunch and let them perform their sickening charade. I would let Robert cough and play the dying father. I would let Patricia dab her fake tears. I would let Trent slide his fraudulent debt assumption contract across the table with his smooth, predatory smile. I would let them completely commit to their federal crime. But instead of handing them a signed contract, I would hand them the sealed red envelope. I would watch them open it. I would watch my mother read the eviction notice. I would watch Trent realize that I had the complete blueprint of his Ponzi scheme. I would watch them realize that their entire fake empire had just been legally dismantled by the daughter they thought was too soft to fight back. I picked up the red envelope. It felt heavy and substantial in my hands. It held my justice, my vindication, and my future. I thanked Jonathan for his help and promised him I would call him the moment the trap was sprung. I walked out of the law office and stepped back into the bustling Chicago morning. The cold rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets clean and bright under the rising sun. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the red envelope resting on the passenger seat. I reached for my phone and dialed my mother's number. It was time to set the hook. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump and forcing my voice to tremble just enough to sound completely defeated. When Patricia answered, I told her exactly what she wanted to hear. I told her I would be there on Sunday. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, watching the morning sun reflect off the wet Chicago pavement. The bright red envelope rested on the passenger seat next to my leather tote bag. It was the physical manifestation of my grandfather's genius and my ultimate salvation. But before I could deliver it, I had to play my part. I had to give the performance of a lifetime. I picked up my phone and stared at my mother's contact name on the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was completely cold and clear. I cleared my throat and practiced taking a shallow, shaky breath. I needed to sound exactly like the broken, terrified daughter they expected me to be. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang 3 times before Patricia answered. Her voice was clipped and impatient, as if I was interrupting her busy morning routine. "Hello, Chloe," she said flatly. "Have you made your decision yet? Your father does not have time for you to drag your feet on this matter." I forced a waver into my voice. I squeezed my eyes shut and channeled every ounce of anxiety I used to feel around her. "Mom," I said, letting my words stumble over each other. "I am so sorry. I was just so overwhelmed yesterday. I did not sleep at all last night. I have been crying for hours thinking about Dad and his diagnosis. I cannot lose him, Mom. I just cannot let him die when we have a way to pay for his treatment." There was a brief pause on the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she realized her cruel manipulation was working perfectly. When she finally spoke, her tone had completely shifted. The cold impatience vanished instantly. In its place was a sickeningly sweet maternal warmth that made my stomach turn. "Oh, my sweet girl," Patricia crooned. Her voice was dripping with venomous fake sweetness. "I know this is so incredibly hard for you. It is hard for all of us. But we are a family, and family has to stick together during the dark times." I gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. Her fake empathy was absolutely repulsive, especially knowing she had laughed about my terror just hours earlier. "I have the paperwork Trent gave me," I told her, keeping my voice pitched low and desperate. "I took it to a notary this morning, just like he asked. I signed the debt assumption clause. I want to save Dad's life, and I want to help Trent save his business. I will do whatever it takes to keep our family safe." "I knew you would do the right thing, sweetie," Patricia said. The sheer relief and greedy triumph in her voice were absolutely undeniable. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully secured my $2 million trust to cover up her son's federal crimes. "Your father will be so incredibly proud of you, Chloe. Why do you not come over for our Sunday brunch tomorrow morning? We can have a nice family meal, and you can hand the documents directly to Trent. We can finally put all of this terrible stress behind us." I told her I would be there at 10 o'clock sharp. I whispered a soft goodbye and ended the call. I dropped the phone onto the center console and let out a long, slow breath. The act was flawless. They were officially preparing the stage for their own absolute destruction. Sunday morning arrived with crisp, cold air and bright blue skies. I dressed carefully for the occasion. I did not wear the oversized hand-me-down sweaters I usually wore to hide my presence. I wore a sharp-tailored navy blue blazer and sleek trousers. I pulled my hair back into a polished professional knot. I looked exactly like the senior forensic auditor that I was. I slid the thick red envelope into my structured leather tote bag and walked out the door. The drive to the exclusive gated suburb took 45 minutes. Every mile that passed felt like shedding another layer of my childhood trauma. For 29 years, I had made this drive, with a knot of pure dread sitting heavy in my stomach. I used to practice apologies in the mirror before walking into their house. I used to pray that I could just blend into the wallpaper and avoid my mother's constant stream of insults. But today, the dread was completely gone. I was not driving to my parents' house. I was driving to my house. I pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the neighborhood and navigated the winding tree-lined streets. The massive 5,000 square foot colonial estate loomed at the end of a private cul-de-sac. The perfectly manicured lawns were pristine. The towering oak trees cast long, elegant shadows across the wide driveway. It was the ultimate symbol of Patricia's high society status. It was the physical fortress she used to look down on the rest of the world. And she did not own a single brick of it. I pulled my practical, sensible sedan into the wide circular driveway. I parked directly next to Trent's aggressively flashy leased Porsche. Sarah's massive luxury SUV was parked on the other side. Their vehicles were shiny monuments to their stolen wealth, bought and paid for by defrauded investors. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin of my car for one final moment. I looked up at the towering marble columns framing the front door. I grabbed my leather tote bag from the passenger seat. I could feel the stiff corners of their envelope pressing against the leather. It was time. I stepped out of the car and walked up the sweeping brick pathway. My heels clicked loudly and firmly against the expensive stone. I did not hesitate. I did not shrink my shoulders. I walked up the marble steps and reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted coffee. From down the hall, I could hear the familiar sounds of their Sunday ritual. I heard the clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china. I heard Sarah complaining about a recent spa treatment. I heard Trent laughing his loud, arrogant laugh. They were sitting in the formal dining room, enjoying a luxurious feast, actively celebrating the fact that they were about to destroy my entire life. They had absolutely no idea that the real owner of the house had just walked through the front door. I tightened my grip on my leather tote bag and walked straight down the hallway toward the dining room. The time for tears was completely over. The time for justice had finally arrived. I stepped into the formal dining room and was immediately hit by the overwhelming smell of roasted meats and expensive perfumes. The massive mahogany table was groaning under the weight of an excessive brunch spread. There were silver platters piled high with smoked salmon, thick pastries, and fresh fruit. The table was set with my mother's most prized possession, her imported gold-rimmed fine china and heavy crystal goblets. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the absolute picture of domestic suburban perfection. But beneath the glossy veneer, the room was completely saturated with an ugly, suffocating atmosphere of pure predatory greed. Everyone was already seated. They all turned to look at me as I paused in the doorway. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head of the table. She wore a pristine white silk blouse and her signature diamond tennis bracelet. She offered me a smile that did not even come close to reaching her cold, calculating eyes. My sister Sarah was seated to her right, aggressively swirling a mimosa in her crystal glass. Sarah wore a smug, self-satisfied smirk that she did not even bother trying to hide. She looked at me like a spider looking at a trapped fly, her eyes darting greedily toward the leather tote bag, clutched tightly in my hands. She was already mentally spending my grandfather's trust fund on designer shoes and luxury vacations. But the most revolting sight in the entire room was my father, Robert. Just 48 hours ago, Patricia had called me weeping uncontrollably, claiming that this man had been diagnosed with aggressive stage 3 pancreatic cancer. She had told me he was weak, terrified, and fighting for his very life. Yet there he sat, looking perfectly robust and entirely healthy. He was actively shoveling a massive pile of greasy bacon, heavily buttered toast, and thick scrambled eggs into his mouth. He even had the sheer audacity to ask my mother to pass him the heavy crystal butter dish. A man dying of late-stage pancreatic cancer does not eat a lumberjack's breakfast. He did not even have the common decency to look ill. When he saw me, he offered a weak, pathetic little cough into his linen napkin, then immediately went back to chewing his food. Trent sat across from Sarah. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. His tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning of the massive house. The arrogant, bloated swagger he usually carried was completely overshadowed by a raw, naked desperation. He needed this money. He was an animal backed into a corner by federal investigators, and he was staring at my bag with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Next to Trent sat a man I had never seen before. He did not fit into my mother's carefully curated aesthetic. He wore a cheap, wrinkled gray suit, and his tie was slightly crooked. He kept nervously adjusting his collar and checking his heavy gold watch. Trent introduced him as Marcus, his corporate attorney, but my forensic auditor brain immediately recognized the type. This was not a high-powered corporate lawyer. This was a bottom-feeding fixer. This was a man hired strictly to push fraudulent, illegal paperwork through the system before anyone could ask any inconvenient questions. He had a thick stack of legal documents resting on the table in front of him, and his hands were practically shaking. He wiped a bead of sweat from his receding hairline, looking like a man who knew he was aiding in a massive federal crime, but was too broke to care. "Come in, Chloe." My mother cooed, her voice dripping with that same sickening artificial sweetness she had used on the phone. "Do not just stand there in the doorway. Come sit down. I had the caterers make your favorite spinach quiche. We are so incredibly glad you decided to join us today." I did not say a word. I walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug. Every step felt perfectly deliberate. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair at the opposite end of the table, directly facing my mother, and sat down. I placed my structured leather tote bag on the floor right next to my feet. Sarah leaned over and took a loud, obnoxious sip of her mimosa. "Are you going to drink anything, Chloe?" she asked, her tone laced with pure condescension. "Or are you just going to sit there looking miserable? You should be happy. You are finally doing something useful for this family instead of just being a selfish disappointment." I felt a brief, hot flash of anger rise in my chest, but I instantly pushed it down. I could not let them see my true emotions. Not yet. I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly maintaining the illusion of the broken, terrified daughter. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, acting exactly like the submissive victim they needed me to be. Trent cleared his throat loudly, unable to tolerate the casual small talk for another single second. Time was running out for him, and he knew it. He desperately needed my signature on his fraudulent debt assumption contract before the federal authorities froze his assets. We do not need to drag this out, Trent said, his voice tight and breathless. We all know why Chloe is here today. We are here to finalize the asset transfer so we can secure the medical funding for Robert. We need to get these documents signed and filed by tomorrow morning. Marcus, the shady lawyer, immediately pushed the thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table. The documents slid perfectly into the empty space right in front of me. I stared down at the crisp white pages. I knew exactly what was printed on them. I knew it was a legal death sentence for my financial future and my professional career. I knew it was the exact mechanism Trent planned to use to shift his federal wire fraud crimes entirely onto my shoulders. Trent reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out a heavy, expensive gold fountain pen. He held it in his sweating hand for a brief moment, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, predatory intensity. Then he tossed the pen across the table. It spun over the smooth wood and came to a stop right next to the fraudulent contract. Just sign on the dotted lines, Chloe, Trent commanded, trying to sound authoritative, but failing to hide the frantic tremor in his voice. Sign the papers, and I will personally handle the rest. You will not have to worry about a single thing. My mother leaned forward, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hands. Do it for your father, sweetie, she whispered, her eyes completely devoid of human empathy. Show us that you actually care about this family. I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. I looked at the fraudulent contract. I looked at the 5 people sitting in that dining room, united by their absolute willingness to destroy my life for their own personal gain. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy, suffocating them with eager, desperate anticipation. I slowly reached down toward the floor. I placed my hand on the smooth leather of my tote bag. My fingers brushed against the thick, stiff edges of the sealed red envelope tucked safely inside. I closed my eyes for one brief fraction of a second and took a very long, very slow, and perfectly steady breath. The air in the formal dining room was completely stagnant. It felt thick and suffocating, absolutely saturated with their collective greed. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I took a moment to simply watch them all. I watched the people who were supposed to love and protect me actively working together to destroy my life. My father, Robert, was still focused entirely on his breakfast. He was a man supposedly fighting for his very life, battling a terminal stage 3 cancer diagnosis, but he was eating like a starving teenager. He could not even be bothered to look me in the eye as he participated in my absolute ruin. Sarah sat next to him, her eyes darting between me and the stack of legal paperwork. She was practically vibrating with the eager anticipation of stealing my future. I knew she was already mentally spending my grandfather's trust fund on designer handbags and luxury vacations. And then there was my mother, Patricia. She watched me with a cold, calculating stare from the head of the table. She wore her false maternal concern like a cheap theatrical mask. She thought she had me completely cornered. She thought I was still the exact same terrified, eager to please girl I had been for 29 long years. She believed her emotional blackmail had worked perfectly. But the vulnerable daughter they knew had died on the front porch yesterday afternoon, the exact moment I heard their true voices through my wireless earbuds. Across the wide table, Trent was physically unable to contain his mounting panic. He shifted constantly in his heavy wooden chair. The fabric of his expensive tailored suit was pulling incredibly tight across his broad shoulders. He was sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning of the massive suburban estate. He looked over at Marcus, the shady, cheap lawyer he had brought along to legitimize his massive federal crime, and gave a sharp, frantic nod. Marcus nervously adjusted his crooked tie and pushed the thick stack of fraudulent debt assumption papers a few inches closer to me across the polished wood. Trent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his heavy gold fountain pen. He tossed it onto the table with a harsh clatter. The shiny gold pen rolled over the smooth mahogany surface and came to a dead stop right against the edge of the legal document. Trent leaned forward, resting his sweaty palms heavily on the table. Sign it, Chloe. Trent commanded, his voice hard and completely stripped of all its earlier fake warmth. We do not have all day to sit around waiting for you to make up your mind. The bank needs this processed by noon to secure the medical funding. Just sign the document so we can all move forward. The entire room went completely silent. Everyone was waiting for me to do exactly what I had always done. They were waiting for me to fold under the pressure. My mother let out a soft, highly theatrical sigh. "Chloe, please," Patricia urged, her voice dripping with a venomous fake sweetness that made my stomach churn. "Do not make this harder than it already is. Your father desperately needs his treatment. Trent is just trying to help us save him. I knew you would do the right thing, sweetie. Just be a good daughter and sign the papers." I looked down at the shiny gold pen. I looked at the crisp white pages of the contract that would legally transfer $2 million of stolen offshore gambling debt directly into my name and send me to a federal penitentiary. I felt the immense crushing weight of their expectations bearing down on me. But instead of the familiar, suffocating panic that used to control my life, I felt a rising tide of absolute crystal clear calm. I did not feel small anymore. I felt like a towering, unstoppable force of nature. I did not reach for the gold pen. I did not avert my gaze to look at the floor. I slowly raised my right hand and placed my palm completely flat against the center of Trent's fraudulent contract. The thick paper felt cold under my skin. I looked directly into Trent's desperate, sweating face, and with one smooth, deeply deliberate motion, I pushed the entire stack of documents back across the mahogany table. The heavy paper slid loudly over the polished wood, coming to an abrupt stop right in front of Marcus. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a heavy gavel slamming down in a silent courtroom. The sudden, totally unexpected defiance sent a massive shockwave of pure confusion straight through my family. Trent's jaw dropped wide open in utter disbelief. Sarah let out a sharp, audible gasp. My father's head snapped up from his plate of bacon. My mother sat back in her chair, her fake maternal smile instantly vanishing into thin air. "What are you doing?" Trent demanded, his voice cracking with raw panic. "I told you to sign it right now." I ignored him completely. I kept my eyes locked firmly onto my mother's face. I slowly reached down into the open top of my structured leather tote bag, resting by my feet. My fingers bypassed my wallet and brushed against the thick, stiff edges of the package Jonathan had given me just hours earlier in his downtown office. I gripped the heavy paper and slowly pulled it up out of the bag. I lifted it high and placed it squarely in the dead center of the dining table for everyone to clearly see. It was a large, bright red envelope. The vibrant, aggressive crimson color was a stark, violent contrast to the pristine white table linen and the delicate pastel patterns of Patricia's expensive fine china. It sat there like a blazing warning label. The envelope was incredibly thick and substantial, sealed shut on the back with a massive glob of black wax. Pressed deeply into the very center of that dark black wax was the unmistakable, intricate crest of my grandfather's personal signet ring. And printed in bold, undeniable black ink across the top left corner was the official seal and insignia of Jonathan's high-powered estate law firm. The shady lawyer Marcus stared at the law firm insignia and physically recoiled in his chair. He recognized the prestigious name immediately, and he knew exactly what kind of absolute legal power it represented. Trent stared at the red envelope in dumbfounded terror, completely unsure of what was happening to his perfect plan. But my mother recognized the black wax seal. She knew it belonged to her father. She knew it belonged to the man who had always seen right through her shallow, selfish, and greedy existence. I placed my fingertips gently against the edge of the red envelope. I slowly slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of Patricia. She looked down at it as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike her. Before I signed anything, I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of the fear she expected from me, "Grandpa Thomas left one final letter. Jonathan said you must read it first." My mother stared at the bright red envelope as if it were a live bomb resting on her fine china. She glanced around the table seeking reassurance from the very people who were conspiring with her to destroy my life. Trent let out a loud, exasperated sigh and tapped his expensive gold pen against the mahogany table. Sarah rolled her eyes and took another long, obnoxious sip of her mimosa. They all thought I was just stalling. They thought this was just another one of my pathetic emotional outbursts. Patricia snatched the envelope from the table. Her manicured fingernails dug fiercely into the heavy red paper. She broke the black wax seal with a sharp snap that echoed across the silent dining room. She did it with pure, annoyed impatience. She pulled the thick stack of parchment paper from the envelope and unfolded it. She smoothed the pages flat against the table with a harsh slap of her palm. Her arrogant smirk was firmly in place. She was ready to read whatever sentimental words my grandfather had left and then immediately demand my signature on Trent's fraudulent contract. I sat perfectly still and watched her eyes scan the top of the first page. I watched the exact second her reality began to fracture. It happened in slow motion. Her eyes widened until I could see the whites all the way around her pale blue irises. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked like a plastic mask melting off her face. The arrogant smirk on her lips twitched and then completely collapsed into a slack expression of absolute horror. The color drained out of her cheeks, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. Her hands, the same hands that had pointed fingers and dismissed me. My entire life began to tremble. It started as a subtle vibration in her fingertips, but quickly escalated into a violent, uncontrollable shaking. The heavy parchment pages rattled loudly against the polished wood of the table, creating a sickening paper drumbeat in the quiet room. The shift in her demeanor was so drastic and so immediate that the predatory energy in the room completely vanished. My father finally stopped chewing his greasy bacon. He lowered his silver fork and stared at his wife, his fake cancer performance entirely forgotten. Sarah placed her crystal glass onto the table, her smug expression replaced by genuine confusion. Trent leaned forward, his desperate swagger faltering as he watched Patricia unravel right before his eyes. The shady corporate lawyer, Marcus, shifted uncomfortably in his cheap suit, sensing the legal disaster unfolding. "What does it say, Patricia?" Trent asked, his voice tight and breathless with rising panic. What did the old man write? Patricia could not answer him. She could not formulate a single word. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. She was not reading a heartfelt letter from beyond the grave. She was reading a formal legal declaration of her own destruction. She was looking directly at a court-certified 30-day legal eviction notice. The document explicitly detailed the extortion clause my grandfather had embedded into his estate trust. It outlined the exact parameters of the poison pill. It stated in clear, undeniable legal terms that any attempt to financially harm or manipulate me would instantly revoke their right to reside in the property. It declared that the massive suburban estate she used to rule over her high society friends did not belong to her. It never belonged to her. It belonged entirely to the trust. And the trust belonged entirely to me. The document laid out the absolute truth. I was no longer the vulnerable daughter she could banish from her sight. I was her landlord. I was the sole legal owner of the sweeping marble staircase, the perfectly manicured lawns, and the crystal chandelier she cherished more than her own children. The paper in her shaking hands stripped away her entire identity. It exposed the massive lie she had been living for the past 10 years. She was not a wealthy elite socialite. She was a charity case living rent-free on my grandfather's dime. And because she had tried to force me into taking on Trent's massive federal wire fraud debts, she had triggered the trap. She had legally forfeited her only shelter. Patricia let out a horrible, ragged sound. It was a sharp, desperate gasp for air, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the dining room. Her chest heaved uncontrollably. The thick legal documents slipped from her trembling fingers and scattered across the beautiful fine china plates, ruining the perfect brunch setting she had so carefully arranged. For the very first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I watched real, genuine tears spill out of my mother's eyes. They were not the fake, calculated tears she used to manipulate my father. They were not the performative tears she used to gain sympathy from her country club friends. These were the hot, bitter tears of absolute terror and total defeat. They ruined her perfect makeup. They dripped down her chin and fell onto her pristine white silk blouse, leaving dark, wet stains. She looked up at me through her ruined mascara. The cold, calculating predator was completely gone. In her place sat a broken, terrified woman who finally realized that she had played her final card and lost absolutely everything. The silence in the dining room was deafening. No one spoke a word. No one moved a single inch. Trent stared down at the scattered papers, his face twisting into a mask of pure dread. Sarah looked back and forth between me and our mother, completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent shift in power. The only sound was my mother's ragged sobbing echoing loudly off the high ceiling of the house she no longer owned. I sat in my chair, completely calm and entirely detached, and watched the empire of lies burn to the ground. The sound of my mother's ragged sobbing was completely foreign to this dining room. For a few heavy seconds, nobody moved. Then Sarah lunged forward. She snatched the thick parchment paper right out of Patricia's trembling hands. Her gold bracelets clattered against the mahogany table as she pulled the document close to her face. I watched my sister's smug, confident expression shatter into a million pieces. Her eyes scanned the bold legal text and the official eviction notice. Her jaw unhinged and her face turned a mottled, furious red. "You cannot do this!" she screamed. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged, cracking under the sheer weight of her panic. "This is our house, Chloe. You are just a pathetic little accountant. You do not have the power to kick us out on the street. You are lying. This is a fake document." I just looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. I told her to look at the trust name on the deed and then look at the signature. I told her that legally they were nothing but unwanted squatters in my property, and their 30 days were officially ticking down. Trent slammed his hands down on the table, causing the crystal goblets to rattle violently. He realized that if Patricia and Robert were being evicted, his entire plan to steal my $2 million trust fund to save his own skin was completely evaporating. The fake medical emergency was dead. The manipulation was dead. He pushed his chair back so hard it crashed to the floor. He lunged forward across the table, his face contorted into an ugly, aggressive snarl. He pointed a thick, sweaty finger directly at my face. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Trent growled, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening register. "I do not care what kind of game you are playing. You are going to pick up that pen and you are going to sign my debt assumption contract right now. If you do not sign it, I will make sure you never work in finance again. I will ruin your entire life. I will destroy you, Chloe." I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still and let his empty threats wash over me. The man leaning over the table was not a powerful corporate investor. He was a desperate, cornered criminal who was completely out of options. I smiled at him. It was a cold, predatory smile that I had learned from Jonathan. I told Trent that he was not in a position to ruin anyone. I reached back into my structured leather tote bag. I wrapped my fingers around a thick, heavy manila folder. I pulled it out and slammed it down onto the mahogany table right on top of his fraudulent contract. The sound echoed like a physical strike. "What is that?" Trent demanded, his eyes darting to the thick folder. He tried to maintain his aggressive posture, but his voice betrayed a sudden sharp spike of absolute terror. I kept my voice smooth and perfectly conversational. I told him it was a complete comprehensive forensic audit. I told him that I'm a senior forensic accountant, and he had made a fatal mistake by underestimating my professional skills. I explained that when he tried to pressure me into signing a blank debt assumption clause, I did a little digging into his corporate shell companies. I reached out and flipped the folder open, spreading the printed documents across the table. I pointed to the highlighted bank statements, the offshore transfer logs, and the impending federal indictment notices I had pulled from public court records. I told the entire room that Trent did not have a successful logistics business. I told him his company was a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. I exposed the fraudulent loans, the offshore sports betting accounts, and the staggering $4 million he had stolen from private investors. Trent's face drained of all color. He stumbled backward away from the table, bumping into the wall. His shady lawyer, Marcus, frantically started packing his briefcase, suddenly realizing that he was sitting in the middle of an active federal crime scene. Marcus grabbed his cheap bag and literally ran out of the dining room, abandoning his client to save himself. But I was not finished. I turned my attention directly to Sarah. My sister was staring at the financial documents, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out a smaller stack of papers. I slid them across the polished wood until they rested right in front of her. I told Sarah that while I was tracing her husband's stolen money, I found out exactly where a large portion of it was going. I told her to look at the credit card receipts for luxury hotel suites in a downtown Chicago. I told her to look at the purchases for diamond jewelry, expensive imported lingerie, and lavish weekend getaways that she definitely never went on. Sarah's hands shook violently as she picked up the receipts. Her eyes darted across the pages, absorbing the undeniable proof of Trent's long-term mistresses. She realized in that exact moment that her perfect, luxurious marriage was a complete illusion. Her husband was not a wealthy, successful businessman. He was a broke federal criminal who was cheating on her with multiple women while spending money he did not even have. Sarah let out a guttural, animalistic noise of pure devastation. She dropped the papers and stood up so fast her chair crashed against the antique sideboard. She turned toward Trent. He opened his mouth to offer some pathetic excuse, but before he could get a single word out, Sarah raised her hand and slapped him directly across the face. The sharp crack of her palm against his cheek rang out through the dining room. Trent staggered sideways, clutching his face in shock. "You disgusting, pathetic liar!" Sarah screamed, her voice tearing through the house. "You told me we were rich. You told me those trips were for business. You are bankrupting us for your cheap hotel tramps." Trent shouted back, his voice defensive and ugly. He told her she was crazy and that he was just trying to keep her living in the luxury she demanded. Sarah shoved him away violently. She grabbed the crystal mimosa glass from the table and hurled it directly at his head. Trent ducked, and the glass smashed into the custom wallpaper behind him, raining jagged crystal onto the expensive hardwood floor. My mother, Patricia, shrieked in absolute terror, crying hysterically about her ruined house and her impending public humiliation. My father, Robert, sat totally frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sudden violent implosion of his entire family. The perfect aristocratic suburban brunch had descended into screaming, chaotic madness. They were viciously turning on each other, tearing each other apart like starving cornered wolves. Trent was aggressively yelling. Sarah was throwing silverware and screaming about his mistresses, and Patricia was sobbing uncontrollably, mourning the death of her fake wealthy identity. I simply sat there at the end of the long mahogany table, folding my hands calmly in my lap. I watched the glorious fire burn. The grand illusion was permanently dead. The brutal truth was finally out in the open. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them because they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. The screaming and the shattering of crystal echoed loudly through the massive formal dining room, but I sat completely still in my chair. I watched Trent clutching his cheek as Sarah hurled another vicious insult at his face. My mother, Patricia, was on her knees frantically trying to gather the scattered pages of the eviction notice as if stacking the papers together would magically undo her new reality. And then my father, Robert, finally decided to speak. He pushed his half-eaten plate of bacon and eggs away from him. He wiped his greasy mouth with a linen napkin and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. His fake terminal cancer illness was completely forgotten. He did not offer a pathetic, weak cough or pretend to be exhausted. He was just a desperate, ordinary man watching his stolen kingdom crumble into dust before his very eyes. "Chloe, please," Robert said, his voice trembling with a pathetic kind of urgency. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot just throw us out onto the street like common criminals. You have to be reasonable about this. We are blood." I looked directly at my father. I looked at the man who had sat by silently and watched his wife emotionally destroy me for 29 years. I looked at the man who had faked a horrific terminal diagnosis just to manipulate my deep empathy and steal my financial future. He was actually trying to play the family card right now. He was actually trying to invoke the sacred bond of blood after spending my entire life treating me like an unwanted burden. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table and slowly pushed my chair back. The loud scraping of the heavy wooden legs against the hardwood floor cut through the chaotic noise of the room. Trent and Sarah stopped their vicious screaming and turned to look at me. Patricia looked up from the floor, her expensive mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick, dark streaks. The entire room went completely silent once again. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the old Chloe to surface and apologize for causing such a terrible scene. I stood up. I reached for my tailored trench coat draped over the back of my chair. I slid my arms into the sleeves and slowly began buttoning the front. My movements were calm and incredibly deliberate. I did not rush. I wanted them to feel the absolute weight of every single second of my departure. I looked down at my father and felt absolutely nothing. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt no guilt. I felt nothing but a profound, icy emptiness. Families do not plot to send their daughters to federal prison. I said, my voice ice cold and completely steady. Families do not fake terminal illnesses to steal $2 million from their own children. Families do not sit around a dining room table, eating bacon and drinking mimosas while actively planning to destroy a person's entire life. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but I held up my hand and stopped him instantly. Since the day I was born, I was nothing to you. I continued my words, slicing through the heavy air like a perfectly sharpened blade. You treated me like a ghost in my own home. You let Patricia tear me down every single day while you sat there and did absolutely nothing. You let Sarah treat me like garbage because it made her feel better about her own shallow, miserable existence. You allowed Trent to view me as a convenient, naive target for his federal wire fraud schemes. You all made it perfectly clear that I was never a real part of this family. I was just the scapegoat. I was just the emotional punching bag you used to make yourselves feel vastly superior. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob and covered her face with her shaking hands. "Oh, Chloe, please," she wailed, her voice thick with pure panic. "This is your childhood home. This is where you grew up. You cannot take my home away from me. I will have nowhere to go. My friends will completely abandon me. I will be entirely ruined." I looked down at my mother crying on the expensive Persian rug. I thought about all the nights I had cried in my tiny apartment, praying for her to just love me. I thought about the time she threw me out of this very house, telling me I was a worthless disappointment. "Today, I am nothing to you but your landlord," I said, my voice ringing with absolute undeniable finality. "You do not own a single brick of this estate. You never did. Grandpa Thomas saw exactly who you were, and he made sure you could never steal what rightfully belongs to me. You have officially triggered the extortion clause in his trust. You have legally forfeited any right to reside on this property. Be out in 30 days. I picked up my structured leather tote bag. I did not wait for their response. I did not need to hear another desperate apology or another pathetic, empty excuse. I turned my back on them and walked away. I walked out of the formal dining room and stepped into the grand foyer. I could hear the immediate eruption of screaming behind me. Trent was yelling at Sarah again. Patricia was wailing uncontrollably. Robert was shouting at all of them to shut up. Their voices blended into a toxic, chaotic symphony of their own creation. It was the sound of greedy, arrogant people finally facing the brutal consequences of their own horrific actions. I did not look back. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door and pulled it open. The crisp, cool suburban air washed over my face. It felt incredibly clean and pure. I stepped out onto the sweeping brick pathway and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. The firm, heavy click of the lock falling into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I walked down the pathway toward my practical, sensible sedan parked next to Trent's leased luxury car. I knew that by the end of the week, Trent would be indicted by federal investigators. I knew that Sarah would be drowning in divorce lawyers and public scandal. I knew that Patricia and Robert would be forced to pack their expensive clothes into cheap cardboard boxes and leave this elite-gated community forever. They would spend the rest of their lives trying to claw their way back to a fake status they never truly earned. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. I put my hands on the steering wheel and looked up at the massive 5,000 square foot colonial mansion. It was my house now. I could sell it. I could rent it. I could do whatever I wanted with it. My grandfather had given me the ultimate weapon to protect myself, and I had used it perfectly. I started the engine and drove down the wide driveway, leaving them completely trapped in the ruins of their own massive greed. 2 months after that explosive Sunday brunch, the dust finally settled, revealing the absolute wreckage of my family's carefully constructed illusions. I sat in my new downtown office, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and felt a profound sense of peace. Trent was the first to fall. 3 weeks later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially indicted him on multiple counts of wire fraud and tax evasion. My forensic audit was the exact roadmap they needed to tear his offshore shell companies completely apart. It was a massive predatory Ponzi scheme. The morning federal agents raided his office. It made the front page of the local business journal and broadcast on every news station. They led him out in handcuffs. His leased Porsche was impounded, and his offshore gambling accounts were entirely frozen. He went from a smug high society investor to a disgraced federal criminal in the blink of an eye. Sarah filed for divorce 2 days after Trent made bail, but there was absolutely no money left. My sister had spent her adult life believing she was vastly superior because she married into extreme wealth. When federal investigators seized Trent's assets, Sarah was left with nothing but maxed out credit cards and the crushing reality of his mistresses. Her penniless divorce played out entirely in the public eye, providing endless entertainment for everyone she had previously mocked. She tried to demand alimony, but you cannot extract alimony from a man facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sarah sold her luxury bags just to afford a cheap lawyer. She moved out of her sprawling home and rented a tiny studio in a neighborhood she used to make fun of. The golden child was completely stripped of her golden armor. Patricia and Robert tried to fight the 30-day eviction notice. They begged and pleaded, but Jonathan's legal paperwork was absolutely ironclad. My grandfather's trust explicitly detailed the poison pill clause, and their extortion attempt had triggered it perfectly. On the 31st day, the county sheriff's department arrived. Patricia was completely hysterical. She stood on the manicured lawn weeping as the moving company boxed up her expensive imported rugs. The neighbors she had spent a decade judging stood on their porches and watched the entire spectacle unfold. The country club gossip spread like wildfire. Everyone learned that the snobby president of the Elite Homeowners Association was actually flat broke and living rent-free in a house owned by the daughter she treated like garbage. My parents were completely humiliated and instantly abandoned by everyone they considered friends. With no savings, they were forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial edge of town. There are no sweeping marble staircases. There is just the cold, hard reality of the life they actually earned. As for me, I sold that massive suburban estate. A wealthy doctor bought the property in cash, and I watched the final ties to my toxic family dissolve into a clean bank transfer. I combined the proceeds with the $2 million sitting securely in my trust fund. For the first time in my life, I did not have to worry about surviving. I quit my demanding job and opened my own independent forensic auditing practice. I now specialize in helping vulnerable people untangle hidden assets during complex divorces and fraud cases. I use the exact same skills I used to expose Trent to protect innocent people who are being financially manipulated by predators. I built a business based entirely on truth and transparency. The accomplishment I'm most proud of is the foundation I launched in my grandfather's name. The Thomas Educational Trust is dedicated to providing financial literacy programs and college grants for young adults who have survived emotional and financial family abuse. I want to make sure that no young woman ever feels trapped by the toxic people who share her bloodline. I want them to know that their worth is not determined by a cruel mother or a passive father. Looking back, I do not regret a single thing about that stormy afternoon or that explosive Sunday brunch. The people who were supposed to protect me tried to throw me to the wolves, but they did not realize I had learned how to lead the pack. I am finally completely and absolutely free. I am completely safe, and I am building a truly beautiful life entirely on my own terms. I just want to remind every single person watching this video that you are incredibly strong and resilient. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family, if you have ever been made to feel small by the people who are supposed to lift you up, I want you to remember this story. Setting strict, healthy boundaries is not a betrayal. Choosing your own mental health and financial security over toxic family loyalty is the ultimate act of self-love. You absolutely do not owe anyone your future. I hope this story gives you the courage to stand up and reclaim your own power. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this journey to justice. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is there right now. Thank you for listening. I promise you always have the power to walk away right now. I sit in my quiet office today and I look out at the city skyline. I realize that the hardest part of this entire journey was not the legal battle. It was not the forensic auditing or the tense moments in the dining room holding that red envelope. The absolute hardest part was changing the way I viewed myself. For 29 years, I was conditioned to believe that I was a secondary character in my own life. My family taught me that my only value was what I could temporarily provide for them. They taught me that love was something I had to earn through complete submission and endless sacrifice. Let us talk about conditional love. Many of you watching this right now know exactly what I am talking about. Conditional love is a transaction. It is a strict ledger kept by the very people who are supposed to protect you. In a healthy family, love is the solid foundation you build your life upon. But in a toxic family, love is a currency. It is handed out as a temporary reward when you are useful, and it is coldly withdrawn the moment you stand up for yourself. When you grow up in that kind of environment, you learn to make yourself incredibly small. You swallow your pride. You ignore your own personal boundaries. You accept the bare minimum, and you convince yourself that it is completely normal. You spend decades chasing a moving target, always hoping that one day you will finally be good enough for them to love you unconditionally. And then there is the reality of financial abuse. We often talk about financial abuse in romantic relationships, but we rarely discuss how frequently it happens within families. It is a dark, silent secret that happens behind closed doors in beautiful suburban homes every single day. Toxic parents and manipulative siblings use money and property as heavy chains to bind you to them. They will quietly drain your savings to fund their luxurious lifestyle. They will demand that you pay their mortgages or fund their reckless business ventures. They will weaponize your natural empathy. They will look you right in the eye and use sacred words like family loyalty and sacrifice to empty your bank accounts. My own father faked a terminal illness to steal my future. That is the ultimate betrayal. They use the bond of family as a weapon of sheer financial destruction. When you finally realize what is happening, society makes it incredibly difficult for you to walk away. People who have never experienced this kind of abuse will tell you that blood is thicker than water. They will tell you that you only get one mother and one father, so you must endure their behavior. They will tell you that you have to forgive and forget because family is everything. But those people are entirely wrong. Blood does not give anyone the right to destroy your mental health. Blood does not give anyone the right to steal your financial security. Setting a strict, firm boundary is not an act of malice. It is not an act of revenge. Setting boundaries is an absolute act of survival. You have to put on your own oxygen mask before you suffocate in their toxic air. There is also a massive misconception about forgiveness. For a long time, I thought that forgiving my family meant I had to let them back into my life. I thought it meant sitting around a holiday table and pretending that the years of emotional torment never happened. But true forgiveness is not about them at all. It is entirely about you. You forgive them so that you do not have to carry the heavy toxic weight of their actions in your own heart. You forgive them to release yourself from the bitterness that will otherwise slowly poison your beautiful future. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. You can completely forgive someone and still absolutely refuse to ever speak to them again. You can wish them well from a very safe distance. Forgiveness does not mean allowing yourself to be a target. You do not have to offer your throat to the people who have already proven they are willing to cut it. I know that many of you watching are in your 50s, 60s, or beyond. You might have spent 30 or 40 years pouring your heart, your energy, and your hard-earned money into siblings or children or parents who have never given you a single drop of genuine gratitude in return. You might feel like it is too late to change the dynamic. You might feel like the pattern is permanently set in stone. I am here to tell you that it is never too late. You always have the power to put the heavy baggage down. You can stop funding the people who treat you like an endless bank account. You can stop answering the phone calls that only exist to make you feel guilty. You have the right to spend your golden years in absolute peace, surrounded by people who love you for who you are and not for what you can give them. When you leave a toxic environment, you might feel incredibly lonely at first. The silence in your home might feel overwhelming after years of chaotic drama. But that silence is actually the sound of true peace. It is the fertile soil where you can finally grow. You will start to attract people who value your true character. You will build a circle of friends, mentors, and partners who respect your boundaries. Those people are your real chosen family. Family is not determined by a birth certificate or shared genetics. Family is determined by mutual respect, consistent kindness, and unwavering support. Have you ever been manipulated by the people who are supposed to protect you? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family? Let me know your story in the comments. And if my journey gave you the courage to stand up for yourself today, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss our next story. Drop a comment right now telling me what state or country you are watching from and what time it is there. Remember, you dictate your own worth. Until next time, Take care of yourself.